Chapter 532. Read. 2 14th gods and 1 15th god join forces. In terms of the speed of nomological erosion, they naturally far surpassed Gu-Nan. If not for the fact that they had to take down the divine Emperor Heaven, Austin and the other two would have been much faster. They would not have given Gu-Nan enough time. In the heavenly worlds, only the 9 spirits heaven, the Grottovoid heaven, and Gu-Nan's god nation were still intact among the 16 star realms. Even Lu-Wan had been massacred by the 3 over-gods at the final juncture, and had no choice but to hide in an unknown little plane. Let's go back and force the heretic gods to retreat, then come back. Austin quickly made a decision. His expression was no longer as solemn as before. Judging from the current battle situation, the world of gods had obtained a great advantage through the correct operation of their strategy. Among the ordinary lords, only Eugene was left, but the world of gods had been completely wiped out. As for the top-notch lords, the world of gods had the advantage from the beginning. Although Boswell had been injured because he had to delay the battle, he had not completely lost his combat power. On the other hand, Austin's initial decision to take down the Divine Emperor Heaven showed that he was right. Without Zhao Renwang of the Divine Emperor Heaven, the world of gods only had 9 spirits, Gu-Nan and a half-crippled Yu Lian. How could they fight the world of gods? The only thing that the lords found hard to accept was that a large number of lords had died at Gu-Nan's hands. Austin can't save you. Gu-Nan appeared before Kotzi's again with a cold smile on his face. He knew what had happened in the world of gods, but it was too late for Austin and the other two to return. The Storm God Nation and the Styx God Nation had fallen completely, and 2 lords had escaped. Only the God Nation of the Nightmare Lord was left. Due to its unique nature, Gu-Nan had placed it last. Kotzi's only smiled calmly. He was one of the first lords to come into contact with Gu-Nan, and he had personally witnessed Gu-Nan's ascension to Dao integration. Kotzi's had been prepared since the start of the war. He was just trying to buy time as much as possible, and at the same time, he was considering how to escape after the Divine Kingdom was destroyed. The death of the Beast God and the Demon King had already given Kotzi's a wake-up call, letting him know that abandoning the Divine Kingdom and escaping wasn't absolutely safe. But after all, he did not know how Gu-Nan had done it. A more normal thought was that he had been intercepted by Gu-Nan in the process of escaping. As for being able to track down a sovereign, that was just too bizarre. The Nightmare Divine Kingdom eventually collapsed. Kotzi sighed lightly. He didn't have time to wait for Austin and the other two to return. His figure instantly disappeared into the dream. For a special main god like him, the dream world was undoubtedly safer than any other place. Gu-Nan seemed to be just as he thought, unable to confirm his whereabouts, and never showed up again. However, after a short while, the Lord of Nightmares received successive news. The Lord of Storms and the Lord of the Styx River had also died in the hands of Gu-Nan. Up until now, counting from Van Leeuwen and Lorenza, as many as 6 main gods had died in the hands of Gu-Nan. It could be said that in this war between the 2 worlds, everyone was in a state of losing everything. The only thing that mattered was who had lost less. Only Gu-Nan had profited greatly. Only you are left. Gu-Nan had already determined Kotzi's location through Sylvia's blood as he murmured. The progress of his sin value was similar to what he had expected. From the 13th to the 14th rank, he needed about 5 main gods. And the Lord of Nightmares, Kotzi's, was the current 5th main god. Advancing to the 12th and 13th ranks didn't help Gu-Nan as much as he had imagined, because the improvement of the laws was mainly in the aspect of accumulation. But the 14th rank was different. If the 15th rank was the limit of the main gods, the embodiment of the laws, then the 14th rank was already beginning to have some clues. For example, the Lady of Darkness Daisy, the God of Death Bayer, and the others were actually at the 14th rank, and their every move could already directly affect the laws themselves. Once they reached the 15th rank, which was Austin's realm, they themselves represented the will of the laws. Evil God, you won't succeed. Sylvia stared coldly at Gu Nan, struggling to speak. Perhaps it was because Gu Nan had attracted too much attention when he was wandering around the three divine nations, but she actually had a chance to speak. However, the large amount of blood loss caused Sylvia's face to turn pale. The effects of a god losing divine blood was even more severe than a normal person losing blood. Gu Nan smiled at her, and the shadow blade instantly slashed across Sylvia's neck. This shadow goddess who had lived for tens of thousands of years had finally died under the shadow. Gu Nan had already collected enough divine blood, and Sylvia was no longer of any value to him. Austin, who was rushing back to the world of gods, froze as if he had sensed something, and his eyes flashed with cold, killing intent. Who did he kill this time? Daisy saw his expression and could not help but ask. Sylvia, Austin said coldly. Dreamscape. As a plane that relied on the existence of the main world, there were some special lifeforms here. The Lord of Nightmares descended with the power of a lord, and could naturally control most of the dreamscape creatures. It was almost like a home field. Gu Nan was well aware of this, which was why he had left Kotsis until the end to ensure that nothing went wrong. A fist suddenly fell from the void, but it did not kill him instantly like before. Instead, it seemed to have hit a nightmare, and it directly passed through Kotsis' body. Kotsis was prepared. Everyone knew that he would hide in Dreamscape, and Gu Nan obviously knew as well. Hence, he did not dare to let his guard down for even a moment. Gu Nan was not dejected, and he was also prepared for it. The Lord of Nightmares was one of the most difficult lords to kill with his body, even if his fists were already half nomological. The best way to deal with dreams had always been laws. Endless shadows began to spread from beneath Gu Nan's feet, and quickly wrapped around Kotsis. Dreamscape provided Kotsis with a home field advantage, but at the same time, it was like a cage that prevented him from escaping. In the eyes of all the lords, Gu Nan was still a newly ascended evil god. His strength lay in his inconceivable body, and the law of shadows provided him with more concealment. Very few people would notice that he was already at the 13th level. He was at the same level as Kotsis, but his law was a shadow that came from the same source as light. This in itself represented unparalleled power. Hence, when Kotsis realized that the entire dreamscape was quickly swallowed by the shadows, he knew that things were not going well. The law of shadows, which was supposed to be deep and obscure, was indescribably domineering in Gu Nan's hands. This was not like a shadow, but more like Daisy's all-devouring darkness. At this moment, a ray of holy light cut into Dreamscape and landed in front of Kotsis, attempting to block the spreading shadows. Chapter 533. Read. By the time Austin arrived at the Dreamscape, the world had already collapsed under Gu Nan's influence. With his current level 13 laws, it was all too easy for him to destroy a demiplane. Even with Kotsis, who was at the same level as him, it was still much easier to destroy than to defend. Without the protection of the Dreamscape, the Nightmare Lord was even weaker than other gods of the same level. In the blink of an eye, he died under Gu Nan's fist. At this point, more than half of the 13 main gods of the world of gods had died, all at the hands of Gu Nan. Other than the 4 top-notch core deities from the 2 great divine branches, Eugene was the only core deity still alive. Austin's figure slowly appeared in front of Gu Nan, followed by the Lady of Darkness, Daisy, and the God of Death. Their gazes were cold and determined. The deaths of so many main gods did not cause them to retreat. Instead, they were even more determined to kill this evil god. Now that things had come to this, there was no longer any need for them to communicate. It was already a matter of life and death. Words had lost all meaning. Austin was the first to attack. He felt pity for his sister's death, hatred for the evil god, and pity for the world. As the embodiment of the holy light, He had a reason to eliminate all evil in this world. The holy sword streaked across the void and landed in front of Gu Nan in the blink of an eye. Austin did not expect to kill Gu Nan with a single strike. He only wanted to stop Gu Nan from escaping. Against the three of them, even Jiu Po would have to retreat. He could not think of any reason for Gu Nan to face them head-on. However, he was destined to be wrong this time. Gu Nan had no intention of dodging. He just stood there without moving. The holy sword fell at a seemingly slow pace, but before it could reach Gu Nan, it was as if it had cut into a ball of mud. Its speed suddenly slowed until it completely disappeared. This time, Gu Nan did not use the evil god's body. He only used the power of the laws to devour the holy sword. Level 14. Daisy, who was standing behind Austin, saw everything clearly, and her voice was filled with incredulity. Gu Nan had become an overgod just over a decade ago. In the blink of an eye, he was already on equal footing with him? Bayer felt that this was even more inconceivable, because he had just fought with Gu Nan. He was certain that Gu Nan had not reached this level at that time. Could it be that he had just advanced? Austin looked at Gu Nan in silence. After a moment, he slowly said, "We might have made a mistake. So the growth of an evil god is achieved by killing God." Hearing Austin's words, Daisy and Bayer looked at each other in sudden realization. They finally understood the secret behind all this. But what followed was the fear and murderous intent towards his natural enemy. Gods and evil gods were indeed two beings that could not coexist. After killing the Nightmare Lord, Gu Nan's sin value had already reached the 14th rank. His laws and body began to advance at the same time, constantly advancing towards the 14th rank. But his breakthrough this time wasn't accomplished overnight. Instead, it was a fast and visible process. Gu Nan could feel himself becoming stronger at every moment. This feeling was enough to make an ordinary person lose themselves, but Gu Nan was able to remain clear-headed. I said, "It's too late." Gu Nan tilted his neck and his bones cracked. The next moment, without waiting for the three to react, Gu Nan's body had already appeared in front of Bayer, and he heavily punched him in the abdomen. Bayer was already on high alert and didn't dare to be negligent. Boundless death aura immediately gushed out, trying to block Gu Nan for an instant. This choice was no different from Daphne's. As long as he could block Gu Nan for an instant, it would be enough for Bayer to escape the danger zone. More importantly, he had two companions with him this time. The instant Gu Nan was stopped by the death aura was enough for them to make a move. But what Bayer didn't expect was that Gu Nan's fist would break through the death aura without any hindrance. It was as if he wasn't affected at all, and his fist directly hit Bayer. No one could withstand a punch from Gu Nan. This iron law was also effective on the death god. Hence, Bayer's divine body shattered like a watermelon. The death god's laws instantly exploded, and the terrifying shockwave even sent Austin and Daisy flying. After countless law fragments fell, only Gu Nan was left standing in place. Bayer's divine body had already been destroyed, and he had also lost a portion of his godhead. Even for a 14th-rank god like Bayer, the loss of a divine body signified the loss of his godhead. This was something that made his heart ache. Austin didn't say a word. The holy sword in his hand appeared again, and he slashed at Gu Nan's back. At the same time, a golden scale appeared in midair and directly fell on top of Gu Nan's head. He had already treated Gu Nan as a true opponent, and he was using everything he had to deal with him. Even Jiu Po had suffered under this move. Later on, even though he knew of the existence of justice, Jiu Po actually couldn't do anything to Austin. He could only passively stall him. Up until the battle at Divine Emperor Heaven, Jiu Po had actually been the one being restrained by Austin. Only after Jiu Po's strength had been suppressed did Austin go and deal with Zhao Wang. But when it came to Gu Nan, the situation was different. The moment the golden scale descended, one end was already covered in dense holy light, while the other began to frantically absorb Gu Nan's law of shadows. This was one of the uses of justice. Austin's own law of holy light was equivalent to his opponent's law of shadows. Both were bound to the scale and could not be used. In this world, he was the only 15th rank over God. Thus, by relying on the quantity of laws that surpassed everyone else, this move of Austin's had always been successful. Gu Nan raised his head. As the golden scale began to absorb the shadows, his body suddenly flashed, and his entire body hid in the shadows. For him, who was at the 14th rank, when he merged with the shadows, it was equivalent to becoming one with the laws. Austin immediately felt a great obstruction in his absorption of the shadows. This was because Gu Nan's body had affected the will of the shadows, causing the laws to be able to resist justice. If it were any other overgod, Austin would definitely persist to the end and directly seal the other party into the golden scale. But Gu Nan was different. His body was too powerful, and even Austin could not afford to use the same amount of power. The reason why justice was that Austin himself had to abide by the laws. In fact, due to the protection of justice, no one could harm Gu Nan in this state unless the golden scale was destroyed first. Left with no choice, Austin could only withdraw justice. At the very least, he would not use this method to deal with Gu Nan. Chapter 534. Read. Austin was known as the Lord of Light and Justice. The power he displayed was mostly holy light, and he rarely used the power of justice. On one hand, he didn't need it, and on the other, he was doing his best to hide his trump card from others. Even if Gu Nan was the reincarnation of an ancient evil god and knew some of the secrets of the world of gods, how could he understand the law of justice? Even in the vast history of the world of gods, there had never been another god of justice. It could be said that this was a law unique to Austin. But now was not the time to think about this. The power of the evil god had exceeded everyone's imagination. He had to destroy him in this battle. The golden scale was temporarily withdrawn, but the holy sword struck again, and Daisy acted at the same time. Darkness and shadows intertwined, and the two merged in the void. They were almost indistinguishable, but the clash of laws was very distinct, and they seemed out of place. The holy sword slashed down, directly cutting the two apart, but it accurately slashed at Gu Nan's shadow line. The law of shadows trembled slightly, and ripples spread out. Not only did it avoid the holy sword's attack, but it also broke away from the darkness. Gu Nan's figure flashed and appeared next to Daisy. The entire process seemed uneventful. His control over the laws had reached an unimaginable level. Daisy could not help but exchange a look with Austin. She was more and more convinced that he was the reincarnation of an evil god. Otherwise, there was no way to explain how he could control the laws so well. Gu Nan only smiled, and his figure had already begun to retreat. He had already gotten what he wanted in this battle. The four top lords were not that easy to kill, so he might as well go back and make preparations. More importantly, Gu Nan, who was already at the 14th level, had enough power to flatten the entire world, and make everyone act according to his will. Without the pressure of survival, Gu Nan was now most interested in the mysteries of the original realm. He really wanted to see if he could forcefully break the barrier between the original realm and the outside world with his current power. However, just as Gu Nan tried to retreat, a Grim Reaper's scythe suddenly landed on the back of his head. The violent aura of death almost knocked him down. Courting death, Gu Nan revealed a sneer and turned around without hesitation. He actually used his face to receive the scythe. Bayer had just reconstructed his body and rushed over, but he hadn't expected Gu Nan to respond in such a manner. He didn't have enough time to change his attack. As for Gu Nan, he allowed the sickle to slash at his face. His right hand suddenly reached out and pressed down on Bayer's head, forcibly twisting this death god's head off. It had been a long time since Bayer had encountered an enemy who had specifically come to engage in close combat with Gu Nan. Bayer was the first one he had encountered recently. His goal might be to stall for time and sacrifice himself to create an opportunity for Austin and Daisy. Unfortunately, he didn't know that these two didn't stand a chance against Gu Nan either. Between opponents of the same level, it was too difficult to make them stay. Gu Nan had previously searched for the Lord Gods because he had destroyed their god nations. That was how he had been able to use this as a lead. Gu Nan dealt with Bayer with a slap, not giving Austin and Daisy a chance to react. He left the Pantheon world in the blink of an eye. With his current strength, no one could stop him if he wanted to leave. He had stayed just to show off his strength, so that they wouldn't bother him in the future. The heavenly world. This time, Gu Nan didn't intend to hide his return. Almost all the Fusing Daos received the news immediately. The Fusing Daos conference started again. Compared to the bleak situation in the Pantheon world, the situation in the heavenly world was much better. Apart from Qin Guanruo, who had died at the very beginning, and Zhao Renwang, who had fought to the death without retreating, the other Fusing Daos managed to preserve themselves and didn't die at the hands of the lords. However, the losses were still very heavy. Out of the 16 heavenly worlds, only 3 were left, and the rest had to be rebuilt. Both sides have suffered losses this time. After everyone arrived, Yulian was the first to speak. Based on the current situation, we should focus on defense. Time is on our side. Her words weren't difficult to understand. After all, most of the Fusing Daos were still alive. Rebuilding the astral world was much easier than giving birth to a new lord. Once the Fusing Daos whose astral world had been destroyed in this battle recovered a small portion of their battle strength, they would be able to participate in the new battle. "I'm afraid the other side won't give us that chance," Dream Immortal said coldly. She was probably the one who had suffered the most among the Fusing Daos who were still alive. She had just been resurrected, expended too much energy on Gu Nan, sustained injuries on the battlefield, and finally had her astral world destroyed. However, Dream Immortal was right. As long as Austin and the others weren't stupid, they definitely wouldn't let up on their attacks. After all, they still had the upper hand on paper. Zhou Jiming said with a smile, "I heard that in the final battle, Gu Nan, you fought 3 lords alone and even injured Bayer?" The Fusing Daos had actually witnessed the battle between Gu Nan and Austin's trio. Yulian also said, "With Gu Nan here, even if the other side sends another lord, we will have a plan to deal with them." Not counting Gu Nan, it was now 4 against 2 in terms of high-end battle strength. The All Heavens basically had no chance of winning. However, Gu Nan just glanced at Yulian and said, "I won't be around for now." He had only come back to consolidate his realm. Once his 14th level nomological laws and body were completely stabilized, the original realm would be his next target. The atmosphere instantly turned cold. Song Fei coughed softly and said, "Gu Nan, you are also a member of the All Heavens. Moreover, the cause of this battle was you all teaming up to kill Fanlun. You want to go find the original realm." Lu Wen suddenly spoke, interrupting Song Fei's words. He looked at Gu Nan and asked. He had no intention of avoiding the other Fusing Daos and directly revealed the word, original realm. At this stage, Gu Nan didn't care if anyone knew where the original realm was. He nodded. Lu Wen frowned slightly but didn't say anything else. He lowered his head and seemed to be thinking about something. Meanwhile, Jiupe just stood above and watched everything calmly. The others didn't know what the original realm was, but now was not the time to be concerned about this. Ba. Monk Fa Kong put his palms together and said, "With the invasion of the gods, the All Heavens will be plunged into misery and suffering. Benefactor Gu Nan, please stay a little longer." Elder Zi Luo also said, "If it's not an urgent matter, why don't you wait until the battle has truly settled down before leaving?" Immortal Dream even stepped in front of Gu Nan and said, "The invasion of the gods is partly because of you, right? If we are defeated this time, you won't have a good ending either. No one had ever forgotten Gu Nan's identity as the enemy of the gods. However, Gu Nan only glanced at the three who spoke and then walked out unhurriedly. Whatever he wanted to do, he would never be influenced by others. Immortal Dream looked at his back and said with a slightly cold gaze, Gu Nan, you are already the enemy of the gods. Do you still want to become enemies with us as well? Hearing this, Gu Nan thought for a moment and then turned around. Countless shadow tentacles suddenly reached out and grabbed Immortal Dream in front of him. The suppression of the 14th level shadow precepts made Immortal Dream, who had lost her astral realm, completely unable to resist. He then reached out a hand and casually snapped Immortal Dream's neck. He looked strangely at the corpse on the ground. Chapter 535. Reading. Without the astral realm, path fusers were essentially no different from ancient sages. They might even be weaker. In ancient times, sages would often leave a part of their spirit in the void for their own safety. To kill them, one had to first find their spirit in the void. Of course, this method was far inferior to that of a modern Star Lord. No matter how well one hid in the void, one could always be found. On the contrary, as long as the astral realm was still there, it could be a good shield. But without the astral realm, these path fusers were very weak. As the controller of dream power, Dream Immortal had a very deep understanding of the rules of the world. But once she lost the Cloud Dream Sky, she couldn't even withstand a punch from Gu Nan. When the vitality of her body was completely cut off, Dream Immortal, who used to be a path fuser, immediately turned into a skeleton. She was swallowed by the rules of shadow, leaving no trace behind. The meeting was silent. Gu Nan raised his head and looked at Monk Fa Kong and Elder Zi Luo, who had spoken earlier. Elder Zi Luo was silent, but Fa Kong kept chanting the name of Buddha. Bao, I have sinned, but Gu Nan couldn't be bothered with them. He turned and rushed toward the original realm, his figure quickly disappearing. After Gu Nan disappeared, Elder Zi Luo smiled bitterly and said helplessly, I regret not listening to Schwerin back then. Schwerin? Yulian frowned and slowly walked down from the platform. She asked, what did Schwerin say? Does he know something? Back then, Schwerin had died inexplicably at the critical moment of his ascension. Moreover, he had died in Gu Nan's territory, which had aroused suspicion. But the scene of Gu Nan's violent murder had chilled the hearts of all the path fusers present. No one would like to coexist peacefully with a lunatic. It could be said that after this battle, if they could return to the previous era where there were many heavens, then Gu Nan would definitely be the one being attacked by everyone. So when Elder Zi Luo mentioned that Schwerin had once said something, everyone's attention was focused on him. Elder Zi Luo shook his head slightly. It's just a feeling. He felt that the gods might be right, that the evil god Gu Nan might destroy the entire world. Li Si actually felt the same way about this point of view, but he had come into contact with Gu Nan too late and discovered it too late. Therefore, he said, he's right. The evil god is a creature that we can't understand. Based on the current situation, his strength has already surpassed our imagination. We must destroy him. To Tao integration stage cultivators, they could tolerate a person who was violent, murderous, and capricious. However, they couldn't tolerate a person who was too powerful. What truly threatened them was Gu Nan's strength, not his personality. I agree. Jiupa stepped forward and said with a strange smile. They can't kill Gu Nan, said Luwen with a frown. At this time, the Tao Integration Conference had already concluded. Luwen and Jiupa met in private, but they were still discussing the topics they had discussed during the conference. At the end of the conference, almost all the Tao integration stage cultivators agreed to join forces to kill Gu Nan. Some even suggested joining forces with the world of gods to make peace with the main god. However, there was still no consensus on whether to join forces with the main god. Only the fact that Gu Nan had to die had been publicly acknowledged. It was just that Luwen had raised a different opinion towards this point of view. I know, said Jupa calmly. Austin, Daisy, and Bayer couldn't kill him even if they joined forces. What can you, Lien, and I do? In a battle of this level, numbers won't help. Luwen looked at Jupa quietly, waiting for his explanation. Jupa raised his head. Gu Nan is looking for the original realm. I want to look for him too. When he returns next time, perhaps we'll know some things. In the world of the Rift, Gu Nan hadn't seen Taoist Yellow Spring for a long time. In the past, when he came here, he would always find a random place to enter. He had never met Taoist Yellow Spring. However, he also knew that Taoist Yellow Spring had always been here. It was just a matter of whether he was willing to come out and see him. This time, he came out. You've become stronger again. Taoist Yellow Spring looked at Gu Nan calmly and said in an inexplicable tone. Since Gu Nan often came to the crack world, it could be said that Taoist Yellow Spring was more familiar with the growth of his strength than anyone else in this world. Gu Nan smiled and said, I want to try and see if I can break the bit wall here. It's worth a try, Taoist Yellow Spring agreed. But before that, I have some new discoveries. Gu Nan couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. Taoist Yellow Spring's body slowly solidified. He looked at Gu Nan and said with a smile, I've made many attempts to exchange materials between the two worlds. I firmly believe that if this kind of experiment succeeds, then sooner or later, living things can be transported. Unfortunately, the previous experiments have all failed. Taoist Yellow Spring shook his head, then looked at Gu Nan and said with a smile, I've made some progress recently. This is the inspiration you gave me. When Gu Nan entered and exited the original realm, Taoist Yellow Spring certainly saw it. The method he used was to forcibly enter the original realm through a trace with his ridiculously powerful spiritual soul. The descent of such a pure will greatly hindered Gu Nan's actions, and even his power was greatly weakened. But in the end, he managed to enter. I extracted the spiritual soul of an ordinary person, wrapped it with the power of the spiritual soul, and then sent it into the crack world. It was a success, Taoist Yellow Spring said. Gu Nan looked up at him and suddenly smiled. You already knew this, right? Didn't you bring Luwen out? Taoist Yellow Spring's expression paused for a moment, then he revealed a dumbfounded smile. It seems that you know more than I thought. I have been to the civilization of Lu Wen's previous life, Gu Nan said casually. You and Lu Wen have communicated before, right? He pretended not to know how to leave. Are you trying to trick Jupa? As for the purpose of Taoist Yellow Spring and Lu Wen, Gu Nan actually had no clue. He was just making a random guess. After all, with his current strength, all kinds of conspiracies and schemes were no longer important. At most, he would not explore the secrets of the original realm. He was still an invincible cultivator. If it weren't for the lack of progress in the Origins of Gods game, he wouldn't even be interested in Taoist Yellow Spring. On the contrary, it was Gu Nan's behavior that made Taoist Yellow Spring unsure how much he knew. He said with a slightly solemn expression, Jupa chose to retreat back then, so he was not qualified to participate in my plan. So, what do you want to do? Gu Nan smiled faintly and looked at Taoist Yellow Spring. Chapter 536. Read. Gu Nan stared at him for a long time, then asked, I left here only a few hundred years ago. Did you find anything? Not at all. I can't figure it out either. Taoist Netherworld looked distressed. So I want to ask you to help me with an experiment. You want me to send someone out? Gu Nan raised his eyebrows. Yes. The expression on Taoist Netherworld's face was very sincere. Perhaps this was his purpose from the beginning, but he initially tried to lie to Gu Nan to help and was unwilling to tell him the truth. This was also very normal. After all, he had spent tens of thousands of years on observing and studying the world in the crack. How could he be willing to easily share the results with others? I'll try, Gu Nan said after thinking for a while. The first attempt that Gu Nan made was to use his 14th order body and laws to force his way into the original realm. But unfortunately, even though he had reached the 14th order, the bit wall of the original realm was still as stable as a rock, allowing Gu Nan to bombard it without the slightest fluctuation. This degree of spatial stability even made Gu Nan feel incredible. He had already entered the interior of the original realm and knew that the laws of space were indeed more stable than those of the outside world, but not to this extent. A bit wall that even a 14th order cultivator could not break. Or, was there some unknown secret behind it? Gu Nan did not think too much about it. He descended into the original realm with his will and returned to the blue planet civilization again. With the existence of the power of laws, Fu Qing was still Fu Qing, and even her appearance did not change much. She even began to learn to put on makeup, just to make herself look a little older, lest people think of her as a monster. And Light Origin, a game that was once popular throughout the Federation, finally gradually left the market after more than 10 years of ups and downs. No game could always be popular, this was a matter of course. Under the impact of a steady stream of new games, the current Light Origin was more like a kind of memory, living in the memory of the older generation of gamers. Even Fu Cheng's Qing Entertainment had long since stopped operating this game, but there was one thing that Fu Qing had been doing in secret. She collected and recorded the information of every player who had completed the second transition and above. This was especially so for players who had completed the third transition. She would observe all of them. Fu Qing had been doing this for years, even though the person who gave her the task had been silent for years. Because every time Fu Qing looked in the mirror and saw that face that was so young that it didn't belong to her, she would recall that memory. On this day, when Fu Qing returned home, she found a stranger dressed in rags sitting in front of her desk, flipping through some information unhurriedly. Fu Qing knew all too well what this information was. Since a few years ago, she had kept this part of the information here and had never changed its position. Are there still no abnormal players? He didn't even raise his head to look at Fu Qing, as if it was natural for him to do so. Yes. Fu Qing spoke without any awkwardness. We've recorded all the high-level players. Most of them are living a normal life. There are also some people who no longer work in the game industry due to changes in their lives. However, we haven't found any dead people yet, Fu Qing said carefully. Gu Nan never told her why he was watching these players, but she seemed to be aware of it herself. Gu Nan didn't care what Fu Qing knew. After he got the information about the game, he had no interest in it. Now, he only knew that his game experiment had probably failed. There was no second transmigrator like him. Or was there some kind of opportunity? Gu Nan raised his head and looked at Fu Qing. Do you want to see the outside world? Fu Qing was stunned. She murmured, the outside world. She knew that Gu Nan's background wasn't simple. It was very likely that he came from a civilization outside the blue planet. Now, she had even gotten his confirmation. Of course, she didn't know that the outside world that Gu Nan was talking about was a place even further out. However, after thinking for a long time, Fu Qing shook her head and said, I'm sorry. I still have a daughter and Qing Entertainment. For now, before she finished speaking, Gu Nan had already raised his hand gently and directly extracted her spiritual soul. He quickly brought it out of the original realm. Gu Nan was just asking. As for Fu Qing's opinion itself, it didn't matter. After a while, Gu Nan wrapped Fu Qing's spiritual soul with the power of the law and began to try to break through the bit wall of the original realm. Unlike the two major worlds, the bit wall of the two worlds had the characteristic of a one-way barrier. It was especially serious for external obstacles, but it didn't have much effect on internal obstacles. And the bit wall of the original realm was almost like an iron wall, both inside and outside. This made it difficult for the creatures in the original realm to leave. Even Gu Nan couldn't bring Fu Qing out in one piece. Therefore, he chose to take away Fu Cheng's spiritual soul. This didn't take too much effort. Back then, Huang Quan Taoist could even take away Lu Wen's spiritual soul. Now, it was naturally easier for Gu Nan. However, the moment Gu Nan left the original realm with Fu Cheng, he suddenly discovered a strange phenomenon. Fu Cheng disappeared. Fu Cheng's disappearance wasn't abrupt. It could even be said that Gu Nan watched Fu Cheng disappear. The whole process appeared clearly in his eyes. The moment they left the original realm, Fu Cheng's spiritual soul seemed to be shrouded by some kind of power, gradually breaking away from Gu Nan's control. This feeling was like the bit wall was naturally extending, covering Fu Cheng's body. So much so that Gu Nan couldn't control her. He could only let her be dragged further and further away until she completely disappeared. But even so, Gu Nan had a hunch that Fu Cheng was still alive. Gu Nan frowned slightly. His consciousness returned to his body. He looked at Huang Quan Taoist and said, "Did you see the spiritual soul just now?" When Huang Quan Taoist heard this, he couldn't help but reveal a solemn expression. He said, "I saw you bring out a spiritual soul, but when you left the original realm, you were the only one left." Gu Nan frowned and thought for a while. As if he understood something, he returned to Cerulean Planet. This time, he randomly grabbed a spiritual soul on the side of the road and directly brought it out of the original realm. This time, the spiritual soul didn't disappear. After Gu Nan left, Huang Quan Taoist said immediately, "I saw it. The spiritual soul is still in your hands?" Gu Nan nodded and then shook his head. He looked at the passerby's spiritual soul that was wrapped in his laws, only to see that the spiritual soul had fallen apart. Gu Nan's treatment of the two spiritual souls was basically the same, so the real difference was actually the two spiritual souls themselves. What was so special about the disappeared Fu Cheng? Chapter 537. Reading. Other than Lu Wen, who was taken away by someone else, everyone who left the original realm had learned some history through various means. However, this history was incomplete, because the history that Gu Nan knew only included the world of gods, not the world of heavens, and there was no god of dusk from the world of heavens. On the other hand, this history seemed to be self-correcting, because Taoist Netherworld clearly saw the 9 spirits in history, not the normal development of history. Did this happen when Lu Wen came out? Gu Nan thought for a long time, then turned to look at Taoist Netherworld. No. Taoist Netherworld shook his head. Lu Wen's spiritual soul has always been in my hands, and I later placed it in the world of heavens, but then he began to break away from my control. At this point, he revealed a sarcastic smile. He actually reached path integration earlier than me. If it wasn't for the fact that he couldn't find my location, I'm afraid he would have come looking for me long ago. After learning that the original realm was just a small world, Lu Wen resolutely chose not to become a saint. He destroyed his body and was taken out by Taoist Netherworld, pretending that he had died under the tribulation of the way. Such a determined and courageous person, of course, would not always be controlled by Taoist Netherworld. As long as he found an opportunity, he would establish his own faction. However, who Lu Wen was not actually any of Gu Nan's business. He only wanted to verify some of his speculations through more experiment. So Gu Nan returned to the Blue Planet again, this time looking for a person called Li Han. Li Han was the first player to advance to the 3rd class since the launch of the game Radiant Origins, which had happened several years ago. Therefore, when Gu Nan found him, Li Han had already become a chubby middle-aged man. Li Han's passion for games was still the same, but Radiant Origins was just an excellent game that was popular for a while, and he rarely touched it in recent years. When Gu Nan found Li Han, he had no intention of showing himself. He directly extracted his spiritual soul from midair. Li Han's spiritual soul was also taken out of the original realm, but it showed another state. Fu Cheng was taken away by the bit wall and was directly out of Gu Nan's control. The passers-by were not affected at all, but they were torn apart when they came into contact with the outside world. Li Han's divine soul also broke away from Gu Nan's control, and then when it touched the bit wall, it shattered. The result of the soul shattering was, of course, completely dissipating in the void. Is there a difference in the strength of the divine soul? Taoist Netherworld also noticed the third type of divine soul and immediately asked. If it wasn't a cognitive difference, then the biggest possibility was that the soul itself wasn't strong enough. Gu Nan gently shook his head. Although he had come into contact with Fu Qing and extended her lifespan with the power of the laws, it had not actually affected her soul. For the sake of caution, Gu Nan simply found another third transition player and similarly used the laws to extend his lifespan. The results proved that his speculation was correct. It had nothing to do with the strength of the divine soul. Fu Cheng's uniqueness still hadn't been found. However, the result of this third transition player's soul test was the same as Li Han's. So now at least one thing could be confirmed. Divine souls who had a good understanding of the outside world would indeed receive special treatment from the bit wall when they left the original realm. Gu Nan couldn't help but speculate that when he left the original realm, was it because his divine soul was taken away by the bit wall, so it had drifted for hundreds of years? I have to find Fu Qing. Gu Nan quickly made this decision when there was no more progress in the experiment. He began to slowly search around the original realm. Although this was a rather large star-like bit wall, with Gu Nan's current level of cultivation, it didn't take long to scan around. Gu Nan didn't find any trace of Fu Cheng's divine soul, but he found some vague traces, which he was sure were brought about by the flow of the divine soul. Fu Cheng's divine soul did indeed wander through the bit wall, but now it was impossible to find a definite location. Had she already left the bit wall and gone to the two major worlds? Gu Nan frowned slightly. The mechanism of Fu Cheng's disappearance was somewhat beyond his expectations. If he had known this would happen, he would have united the two realms first before considering the problem of the original realm. What Fu Qing had obtained was the history of the Pantheon world, so it was very likely that she would go to the Pantheon world. Without an organization that traversed both worlds, it would be very difficult to find Fu Qing in the various major planes. But even if she wants to rise, she still needs some time. She has to hurry. Gu Nan's gaze began to fall upon the Pantheon world. The few remaining lords did not know why, but he suddenly felt a chill run down his spine. The Pantheon world. Just as the Tao integration cultivators had predicted, the core gods definitely wouldn't give up just like that. Instead, they were going to make use of this final period of time to completely conquer the world. We don't have much time. Lady of Darkness Daisy said solemnly. Once those Tao-fusing individuals rebuild their divine nations, it will be our turn to suffer. Bayer gritted his teeth and said, the biggest problem now is that evil god. If we can think of a way to deal with him, we will still have the advantage. Even though a portion of Bayer's divinity had been destroyed by Gu Nan's scheme when he was surrounded by the three of them, he was not afraid of this. Gu Nan was able to hit him because he was trying to block Gu Nan's path. If he had been bent on leaving, Gu Nan might not have been able to catch him. Austin slowly said, I've looked through all the documents, but there are no records of the evil god. There isn't even a bit of relevant information. That's normal, Daisy said. The rumors about the evil god are all vague indications in some prophecies. There have never been any clear record. In the legends of the Pantheon world, the evil god was more like a symbolic reference. It was the embodiment of evil and represented all the evil in the world. It was precisely because this description was too abstract that before Gu Nan appeared, very few people would take the existence of the evil god seriously. However, to the current core gods, not being able to find any information about Gu Nan meant that they could not find his weakness, let alone find a way to deal with him. Boswell, who was at the side, was silent for a long time before he finally said, the evil god might not be flawless. As far as we know, he is just an ordinary core god with an incomparably powerful divine body. The Master of Pale Azure's words opened up a new line of thought for them. Even though he was a legendary existence, it might be easier to find a way to deal with him based on reality. However, at this moment, an undisguised aura barged into the Pantheon world, causing the expressions of the core gods to change. He actually dares to come alone. Bayer, who had suffered at the hands of Gu Nan twice, was the first to speak. Austin, however, frowned and said, "Be careful of traps." Chapter 538. Read. The Lady of Darkness was a rank 14 Lord God. In the world of gods, Austin was the only rank 15 powerhouse, and was known as the King of Gods. The Lady of Darkness, Daisy, was the only one who could fight him. With darkness in her body, she had no fear. Gu Nan stood at the border of the world of gods and did not move forward, because the darkness in front of him was already filled with darkness. Endless darkness spread from all directions, as if it wanted to drag Gu Nan into an eternal abyss. It was the deepest black, and any matter or law that came into contact with the darkness would be directly engulfed, leaving no trace behind. Gu Nan stood where he was, and the shadow under his feet began to spread, intertwining with the approaching shadow. But if one looked closely, they would find that the two laws were actually devouring each other. On the surface, they were inseparable, but on the inside, they were clearly separated. They both had devouring characteristics, but the power of the law of darkness was even purer than that of Gu Nan's shadow. For a Lord God-level law, its nature was often more important than its level. Gu Nan and Daisy were now at the same level, and there was not much of a difference in the level of their laws. Even their control over the laws was almost the same. The outcome of the battle was decided in an extremely short amount of time. It was a draw. For two people at this level, an instant of contact was enough for them to determine the outcome. Daisy was a little surprised by this result, because it meant that Gu Nan's law power might have already surpassed Yulian's level. But she was not in a hurry because she was not fighting alone. If she was in a disadvantageous position, the other three would act immediately. Gu Nan used shadow to fight the darkness, and after confirming his control over the laws, he did not have any intention of tangling with Daisy. This time, he came to flatten the world with his own power. What was a flatten? No matter who stood in front of him, he would crush them all. That was a flatten. Gu Nan took a step forward, and under the incomprehensibly powerful suppression of his body, the darkness that was entangled with the shadow was instantly shattered. Step by step, Gu Nan walked out of the darkness. Even the laws controlled by Daisy could not stop him. Gu Nan waved his hand and shattered the darkness, then slowly walked into a spatial tunnel. On the other side was a divine kingdom. This was Bayer's kingdom of death. The death god's divine kingdom was a very special place. It was a place where the souls of the living would gather after they died. In many main planes, people didn't know about the holy kingdom of the god of death. Instead, they called it the realm of dead souls, which was similar to Stanley's realm of devils. As soon as Gu Nan set foot in this place, he unleashed his law of shadows and wiped out a large number of spirits. There was no way they could survive. The Grim Reaper Bayer was the first to appear, coldly sizing up Gu Nan. The Grim Reaper's scythe cleaved downwards, but Gu Nan didn't even bother dodging. This wasn't the first time Bayer had fought with Gu Nan, so he was very familiar with Gu Nan's combat methods. Thus, he wasn't surprised at all. He continued to cleave downwards with his scythe, rapidly accumulating the deathly aura in Gu Nan's body before exploding. In the previous battle between the two, Gu Nan had used the eruption of deathly aura to kill Boswell once, while he himself remained unharmed. Thus, Bayer was very clear that at least that level of deathly aura was meaningless to Gu Nan. But this time, the deathly aura was 3 times that of the previous explosion. However, this explosion of deathly aura didn't bring about the result Bayer wanted, because Gu Nan's body was already far stronger than before. The explosion of deathly aura produced a muffled sound, but it didn't even manage to completely blast Gu Nan to pieces. It only blasted a hole in his abdomen, which healed in the blink of an eye. A cold smile appeared on Gu Nan's face. His nomological laws were still wreaking havoc, and he had already punched Bayer's face. However, Bayer was already prepared, and this was his home ground. In an instant, life and death were exchanged, and Gu Nan's punch was merely a corpse. Austin and Daisy had already arrived, and they attacked without any hesitation. Austin attacked Gu Nan, while Daisy prevented the shadow nomological laws from spreading. Gu Nan didn't show any intention of running away. He simply punched Austin, and the nomological laws didn't retreat at all. He was actually going to fight 3 peak main gods at the same time. In the heavens, Gu Nan's reappearance after disappearing for a period of time immediately attracted the attention of all the Tao integration practitioners. What attracted even more attention was his actions. Is he crazy? Even if he wants to deal with a main god, there's no need to face him head-on, right? Li Si couldn't understand Gu Nan's actions. This doesn't seem like his style. He must have some ulterior motive. Mu Qishuang of Blue Sky also chimed in. She had personally witnessed Gu Nan's plot to kill Lorenza. In her eyes, Gu Nan was undoubtedly a person who was especially adept at scheming and scheming. Elder Zi Luo merely smiled and said, "No matter what he's thinking, killing a main god is our top priority right now. I'll go." Jiupa stood up calmly and said, "Boswell didn't attack. Yulien, stay behind and provide support." Yulien, who was sitting at the head of the table, nodded lightly. Her face was somewhat pale, and it was clear that her previous injuries were quite severe, to the point where they were difficult to conceal. "I'll go too," another person stood up and said. It was Lu Wen. Within the Death God's divine kingdom, the battle between Gu Nan, Bayer, and Austin had already entered a white-hot stage. One had to admit that the combined power of 2 peak main gods was quite impressive. Even the 14th level Gu Nan only had the upper hand and was unable to kill them. But that didn't matter. The strength of a god was in their divine kingdom, and their weakness was also in their divine kingdom. Gu Nan was very clear about this. Since the battlefield was within the Death God's divine kingdom, Austin actually couldn't use his full strength. For example, he couldn't use the method he had used to injure Yulien here. But Gu Nan didn't have such concerns. He could change the battlefield repeatedly, and just the shock waves of the battle alone would cause great damage to the divine kingdom. To make matters worse, Jiupa had arrived. This Lord of Jiupo was also an expert in exterminating clans. He didn't even look at Gu Nan, and directly used laws to clean up the Death God's divine kingdom. Instantly, the earth veins flipped, and the 9 underworlds wreaked havoc. Daisy couldn't deal with Jiupo alone, so she joined forces with Gu Nan. Kill Jiupo. Austin realized that if this continued, the situation would only become more and more disadvantageous, so he immediately said. They couldn't deal any effective damage to Gu Nan at all, and could only try to heavily injure Jiupo first. However, Bayer shook his head and said, "Even without Jiupo, we still can't deal with the heretic god. Right now, there's only one way." Austin turned around, and saw the ruthlessness and determination in Bayer's eyes. This death god never lacked boldness. Chapter 539. Read. Justice was a very special type of law, so special that apart from Austin, no one had ever grasped it. Even when Gu Nan released the game Radiant Origins on the Blue Planet, he had only taken the law of light and had not given the players the justice part. The effects of this type of law were too strange and could accomplish many inconceivable things. If it was given to the players, the entire game would probably be ruined. And Austin could control this type of law because he had comprehended the law of justice. At the same time, he would be restricted by justice and be unable to do many things, but the players would not be restricted. But Austin had paid such a huge price, so that justice, he had grasped, was naturally worth it. He had used an inconceivable method to injure Yulien, and now he was using justice once again, but this time, it was to completely destroy Gu Nan. The golden scales floated in the air. On one end was the white holy light that flickered with a holy radiance, and on the other end was the death god's scythe that was surrounded by the aura of death. The two of them suddenly stopped, causing the entire battle to pause. Daisy raised her head in astonishment and looked at the two's actions. She did not even think before rushing towards the divine kingdom, disappearing in the blink of an eye. Giopa seemed to understand something and wanted to immediately retreat from the divine kingdom, but he was entangled by the aura of death and could not escape. After all, this was Bayer's home ground. When he completely disregarded the citizens of the divine kingdom and wholeheartedly wanted to stop them, it was still somewhat effective. Not only was Bayer bold, but he was also very greedy. Not only did he want to keep Gu Nan here, but he also wanted to get rid of Giopa once and for all. Giopa had already seen light and darkness interweave once, and the terrifying power that erupted from it. And this time, it was another set of opposing laws. Life and death. Not only could the holy light display the nature of light, but it could also display the nature of life. Austin and Bayer both used their weapons as proof and placed them on the two ends of the scales, and the amount of power they actually used was enormous to an unimaginable degree. Bayer directly placed his entire divine kingdom on the scales, and even took out the majority of his divine spark. It could be said that he was betting his life on this battle. The item that Austin took out wasn't weak at all. He had stripped out all of his laws related to life and placed them in this sacred sword, just like what Lu Wen had done in the past. After this battle, no matter what the result was, Bayer would lose his combat strength for a very long time. As for Austin, he would lose all comprehension of life and would need to start all over again. The price that the two of them paid could not be said to be not heavy, but the benefits that they brought were naturally considerable. Let's go. Giopa seemed to have sensed something. The power of the netherworld crazily collided with the deathly aura, trying to force an exit. At the same time, he shouted at Gu Nan. However, Gu Nan's expression remained calm as he gazed at the boundary between life and death. When life and death were on opposite ends of the scale at the same time, the holy sword and the grim reaper scythe suddenly floated up slowly, and then heavily slashed together. After the silent collision, an inexplicable shock wave erupted in the void. It was like the first explosion of the universe. All matter was thrown out crazily, and all laws could no longer exist. Giopa didn't even have time to let out a grunt before his body was instantly annihilated. Gu Nan didn't seem to be in a much better state. His body had been blown to pieces, and countless pieces of flesh and blood had been pulverized in midair by the shock wave. Austin had long since retreated. This collision of life and death had happened to be Bayer's entire divine kingdom. Thus, there was no way that the divine kingdom would remain after the explosion. Giopa had completely disappeared without a trace. He could be considered to have been extremely unlucky. He had only come to help out, but who would have thought that he would run into Austin and Bayer's ultimate attack, causing him to suffer such a great loss. Even if he didn't die, his injuries wouldn't be any lighter than Yulien's. But whether it was Austin, Bayer, or Daisy who had just arrived, all of them were focused on Gu Nan. He's dead. Daisy glanced at the divine kingdom below her. There was no longer any aura of life. Instead, it was in a state of alternating between life and death. After the eruption of the deathly aura, the void around the grim Reaper kingdom had been completely polluted. In the future, if any living being were to enter this place, they would immediately be transformed into a half-living, half-dead person. Austin shook his head, then nodded. I don't know yet, but even if he's not dead, he's already left behind a fatal flaw. He's not dead. Bayer licked his chapped lips and grinned. The seal of life and death has already been planted. The rest is up to you guys. As if to verify Bayer's words, the evaporated flesh and blood began to gradually reform in the void, once again taking on Gu Nan's appearance. When Gu Nan was at the 13th rank, the main gods still had a chance. But now that he was at the 14th rank, the evil god couldn't be killed through normal means. At the very least, in the game, Gu Nan had never seen an NPC main god kill a player who had reached the 14th rank. As long as they didn't court death, they would generally be able to clear the stage. Even if Gu Nan set up a trap to kill an existence like the evil god, it would still be an extremely difficult task, not to mention that the main gods didn't understand his abilities at all. The seal of life and death? Gu Nan lowered his head and glanced at himself. Indeed, there was a strange seal on his abdomen. He had never seen such a thing before. In the game, it was almost impossible for Austin to team up with Bayer. Naturally, there wouldn't be a seal of life and death. Normally, the final stage that players had to face would be Austin and Daisy working together. It was only because of the abnormal development of the war between two worlds that such a strange scene would occur. After saying those words, Bayer disappeared in the blink of an eye, leaving only Austin and Daisy. Gu Nan wasn't in a hurry to chase after him. In any case, he still had a portion of Sylvia's blood, so Bayer couldn't escape. Instead, he was more curious about the use of this seal. Austin quickly told him the answer. He used the holy sword in his hand. The holy sword accurately pierced the seal on Gu Nan's abdomen. As a result, the seal was instantly activated. Gu Nan felt a strange power emanate from within his body, affecting him from the inside out. Even the evil god's physique couldn't block this power. It rapidly spread throughout Gu Nan's body, transforming his body into a strange state. That was the state of death. The effect of the seal of life and death was to activate when hit by a certain amount of power, turning the target from life to death. Gu Nan's body died in an instant, but he recovered in an extremely short period of time. Clearly, the power of the seal couldn't be maintained for long. But for Austin, this instant was enough. Just as Gu Nan regained his mobility, the holy sword pierced the seal once more. As a result, Gu Nan was once again transformed into a dead state. Chapter 540. Read. The existence of the life and death mark made Gu Nan unable to move at all. He could only watch as he was killed again and then revived. However, Gu Nan was not in a hurry. As the revival time dragged on, Austin could not make accurate predictions every time. He would make a mistake sooner or later. As long as there was a small gap, Gu Nan would be able to escape. Just as Gu Nan had thought, this was Austin's first time seeing the life and death mark. How could he make accurate predictions every time? On the 26th revival, the holy sword stabbed out a little earlier, which triggered the mark and revived Gu Nan earlier. Gu Nan suddenly opened his eyes and punched at Austin's face. Austin did not even dodge and allowed Gu Nan's punch to hit him. He wanted to stab the mark again. Gu Nan became a dead man again, but he was not in a hurry. Even if he died, the evil god's body would not be damaged. Austin still could not do anything to him. In order to stab the sword, Austin took Gu Nan's punch head-on. His divine body was already shattered. Even though he quickly reformed his body, the godhood he lost was real. When Gunnan, who had died once again, woke up, he was still greeted by Austin's holy sword. However, there was an additional daisy behind him and a scale above his head. The next time, the laws of light and darkness intertwined in the scale, but it was different from the one that injured Yulian. Last time, in order to prevent Yulian from escaping, he had been in a hurry, so he could only try his best to explode. However, it was very difficult to kill Gu Nan. Austin knew this very well, so he had to stall Gu Nan even if he had to lose some godhood. He was stalling for time to complete the seal. That's right, the laws of light and darkness were intertwining in the golden scale. For the first time, the two top main gods put aside their differences and worked together to completely seal the evil god. If not for the life and death mark, they would not have had the chance to set up the seal. On the other hand, without the darkness chief god's seal, the mark would be meaningless. Just as Gu Nan opened his eyes again, the black and white lights in the golden scales fused completely, forming a spell formation that was filled with mysterious patterns and pressed down on Gu Nan. Gu Nan, who had just been resurrected from the dead, was imprisoned by this sealing formation. Austin was finally isolated and unable to stab the mark of life and death. After completing this step, Austin and Daisy heaved a long sigh of relief. In front of them, Gu Nan was standing calmly, and there was a ring of strange light flickering around him, like a cage trapping him within. Without any hesitation, Austin waved his hand and sent the cage flying into the endless void. If everything went smoothly, perhaps after a few years, there would be new myths and legends circulating in the world of gods. The evil god descended from beyond the heavens and engaged in an earth-shattering battle with the other gods. 8 of the main gods perished in this battle. In the end, the light and darkness god systems put aside their prejudices and joined hands to seal the greatest evil demon, but the problem was that things did not go smoothly. The light and darkness cage from the golden scales was not as sturdy as imagined. Gu Nan punched the cage of light, causing the entire cage to tremble uncontrollably. At the same time, there was a powerful rebounding force. It's useless. Light and darkness are the foundation of all the laws in the world. This cage can also reflect all the laws in the world. Austin's figure slowly walked out of the void, his gaze landing on Gu Nan. Even though he said it was useless, he did not seem to relax at all. If Daisy and the others could deal with the world of gods, he did not mind staying in the void and watching Gu Nan's every move. Boom! Another punch landed on the cage of flowing light. There was no medium for sound to flow in the void, but the sound of the collision seemed real. This was when the laws collided. The overly powerful laws began to distort the laws of nature, directly affecting the spiritual senses of living beings. Austin stared coldly at Gu Nan, his eyes capturing the information in front of him until Gu Nan's next punch landed. This punch seemed to be very special. There were strange patterns on the fist, and the moment it hit the cage, these patterns began to revolve around the light and darkness formation. This was Gu Nan's law of shadows. It only slightly affected the fusion of light and darkness for a moment. Gu Nan's punch landed and blasted the light and darkness cage open. The fusion rate is too low. Gu Nan shook his head and commented, "If it was after the 5th Divine War, your cooperation would be much better." In the 4th Divine War, Austin and Daisy actually did not fight much. Both of them were more of a deterrent force, and they did not understand each other well enough. Austin looked at him silently, not really understanding the meaning of this sentence. So far in the world of gods, there had only been 4 divine wars. But this did not affect Austin's attack. He thrust his holy sword at the seal of life and death without hesitation. Unfortunately, he did not manage to stab it this time. Gu Nan's figure shattered like a shadow, and then he appeared behind Austin, his fist already smashing down. Austin turned around and struck again without thinking. He did not care about himself at all, only wanting to send Gu Nan into a state of death. A smear of darkness appeared in the void. It was Daisy hiding in the depths of the void. She attacked together with Austin, and her target was the seal of life and death on Gu Nan's body. It could be said that Bayer had staked his entire divine kingdom on this attack. He had finally created a flaw in Gu Nan's perfect power system, making him unable to act recklessly. But Gu Nan seemed to have predicted their actions. He suddenly retracted his fist, and once again turned into a shadow and disappeared. "He's trying to lure you out." Austin saw this and immediately said to Daisy, "Bayer is in danger." They knew that Gu Nan had the ability to track down gods. Now that he had disappeared without a trace, it was most likely that he was looking for someone else to attack. The two instantly fled into the void and hurried to the plain where Bayer was. However, everything seemed calm and peaceful. Gu Nan did not appear here. Bayer, on the other hand, looked at the two strangely. "Have you dealt with him?" "Not yet." Daisy shook her head and looked at Austin. "Could it be that he wants to erase the seal first?" "Impossible." Before Austin could speak, Bayer said decisively, "The seal of life and death is rooted in the soul. Unless he can change to another soul, it will definitely exist." Before the three finished speaking, their expressions changed at the same time. This was because they sensed that yet another divine kingdom had received grievous news. It was obvious that they had suffered a sudden attack from Gu Nan. Gu Nan had indeed changed his target. However, his target was not Bayer, but another main god. Chapter 541. Read. Songqing Divine Kingdom. Gu Nan's arrival was beyond everyone's expectations. Even Boswell himself was paying attention to Bayer, but he did not expect Gu Nan to come to his own divine kingdom. This was not a matter of thinking loopholes, but a normal person would not choose to do so. Even a peak main god would not be able to deal with the Songqing divine kingdom in a short period of time. The spread of the laws needed time, and the cleansing of the citizens needed even more time. After the initial shock, Boswell quickly calmed down and began to deal with Gu Nan's attack. He did not reveal himself and only used the laws to resist Gu Nan's invasion. This master of Songqing was obviously very experienced. Even with Gu Nan's proficiency, his progress was not fast. Austin and Daisy arrived soon after and quickly attacked Gu Nan. Their target was, of course, the life and death mark. The body was intrinsically affected by the divine soul. The life and death mark directly landed on Gu Nan's divine soul, which meant that as long as he condensed a body, the mark would definitely appear. And in the master of Songqing's territory, with Austin and Daisy present, Gu Nan could not only use the laws. If he did so, he would definitely be suppressed in all aspects. He had to condense the body of the heretic god, but the body was also planted with the life and death mark. The target that could be attacked would either be protected or difficult to take down in a short period of time. This seemed to be a dead end. But Gu Nan never felt that it was a dead end. At the same time that Austin and Daisy arrived, Gu Nan's figure flickered and appeared directly above Austin's head, his fist descending without hesitation. Austin's reaction was no different from before. He completely ignored his own body and raised his hand to stab at the life and death mark. But this time, Gu Nan did not choose to dodge. His fist smashed into Austin, and the terrifying power from the heretic god's body instantly destroyed Austin's divine body. And the moment the sacred sword stabbed into his divine body, more than half of his body suddenly turned into a shadow, including the abdomen where the life and death mark was planted. The life and death mark was a very magical thing. It directly affected the divine soul and did not disappear just by transforming the body into the laws. If the entire body turned into a shadow, then the mark would not move at all, and the sacred sword would still stab into it. But Gu Nan's way of handling it was very strange. He had turned the body below his abdomen into a shadow, but left the upper half of his body intact. This caused his soul to naturally shrink and concentrate on the upper half of his body. As the soul moved, the life and death imprint naturally moved along with it. Thus, the holy sword strangely missed its target. After all, Gu Nan was a veteran player who had fought countless main gods. Even though it was his first time encountering the mark of life and death, he immediately noticed its pros and cons. The life and death mark was undoubtedly very powerful. Although it had a time limit, it could directly affect Gu Nan, which was already terrifying enough. However, the weakness of this kind of imprint was that the intensity of the activation was limited by the target. In other words, the more powerful the target was, the greater the power needed to activate the mark in order to injure the target's divine soul. With Gu Nan's current realm, there were only a few people in the world who could trigger the mark of life and death. It would be useless even if others were to hit the mark. This characteristic could also be used by Gu Nan on Austin. Although Austin had enough power to activate the mark, he also had to concentrate his power. It was impossible for him to carry out a large-scale attack, which gave Gu Nan a chance to dodge. It was because of this series of psychological games that Gu Nan successfully deceived Austin once. Not only did he not get the mark concentrated on him, but he also successfully shattered his body. Although Austin reformed his divine body in an extremely short time, damage to his godhead was still damage. Even Austin could not reconstruct his divine body indefinitely. If he lost too much of his godhead, there was even a possibility that his realm would drop. The three of them faced each other again. Previously, Gu Nan's move of transferring the mark had also fooled Daisy, causing her to return empty-handed. The people of Tsangqing Divine Kingdom were still being killed by Gu Nan quickly. Looking at Austin and Daisy, Gu Nan suddenly revealed a smile. Then, under the surprised gazes of the two, Gu Nan suddenly turned around and ran. He did not leave Tsangqing Divine Kingdom. Instead, he ran with his legs. His speed was unbelievably fast. Austin's figure tore through the void, bringing with him an endless amount of holy light as he descended in front of Gu Nan. However, before he could even attack, Gu Nan had already abruptly changed directions, and in the blink of an eye, not even his shadow could be seen. The second weakness of the mark of life and death was, how could one hit the mark when one could not even catch an enemy? The body of the evil god represented a comprehensive strengthening of the body. There were too many tactics that Gu Nan could use, each of which was different from a normal battle of the main gods. Austin and the others could not adapt to it. Austin stopped and said to Daisy, "Let's guard Tsangqing Divine Kingdom and let Boswell come." Actually, he did not need to say much. Daisy also knew what to do. They were all top figures, so naturally they could make the most correct decision. Originally, when Gu Nan was running, the shadow rule that was constantly eroding Tsangqing Divine Kingdom seemed to have suddenly encountered resistance, and its progress suddenly slowed down. This was because the rule of light and darkness had already interfered, greatly restraining the shadow's advance. This also allowed Boswell to free up his hand. Therefore, as Gu Nan was moving forward, a green light suddenly soared in front of him and went straight for the mark on his abdomen. This attack was extremely accurate. It was so accurate that it seemed to have predicted all of Gu Nan's movements. The moment before the green light reached his body, Gu Nan twisted his body to an angle and faced the green light with his waist. The green light instantly penetrated his waist. Obviously, this was an attack that Boswell had accumulated a large number of rules. Its strength was definitely not low, and it was completely enough to trigger the mark. Being in his own divine kingdom, Boswell could easily predict Gu Nan's movements. He could also accurately attack the mark of life and death, which was the best choice to deal with Gu Nan. Similarly, if Gu Nan dared to enter the Holy Light Kingdom, then Austin would definitely be able to easily hit the mark. However, in order to achieve this, Boswell was also forced to condense a divine body. Only with a sufficiently powerful gathering of rules could an attack of sufficient strength be launched. However, Gu Nan was not afraid. He began to dodge left and right, and even had the time to disturb Austin and Daisy to speed up the progress of the shadow erosion. In the end, he even ran near Boswell's condensed divine body and gave him a punch from time to time, causing chaos again. Throughout the whole process, Boswell was stunned that he could not hit Gu Nan even once. Gu Nan could shrink his body, enlarge it, and turn it into a rule. There were many ways to change the position of the mark, but the Dark Green Lord only knew how to use the dark green light. His realm was not enough, and he had suffered some injuries, so he could only rely on this method to condense a large number of rules. Chapter 542. Reading. In a war in a divine kingdom below the level of a lord, the large-scale killing mainly relied on mortal troops, but it was different for a lord. For a powerhouse at this level, they themselves were powerful enough to cover half the world with the laws and did not need the help of mortals. No matter how well coordinated the mortals were, how could they compare to the laws of a lord? This was what Gu Nan was doing now. He used the laws to constantly erode the Tsang-Qing divine kingdom. Even with Austin and Daisy working together to defend, the number of gods was still decreasing. Some died in the hands of Gu Nan, some fled because their faith was not strong enough. This phenomenon was very normal and had nothing to do with realm or power. After all, there were too many places to defend, and no one could be foolproof. Moreover, the invasion of a divine kingdom was not a war. The lost land could be recovered, and as long as the gods died, they could not be resurrected. As the gods died one after another, the power of the Tsang-Qing divine kingdom was constantly weakening, and even Boswell's power was weakening. Although he was still condensing laws and trying to hit Gu Nan's life and death mark, it was futile for a long time, causing Boswell to feel a little confused. He began to understand why Bayer had resolutely gambled the entire divine kingdom just to create an opening for Gu Nan. Such an enemy was too difficult to deal with. Even if he already had the biggest weakness, the other party still used various means to hide the weakness well, relying on his own strengths to deal with it. It was hard to imagine how despairing a complete evil god would be. As the oldest main god in the world, Tsang-Qing was slightly distracted by the outside world. Therefore, at this moment, Gu Nan suddenly punched Boswell. The god's body exploded. Austin could not help but sigh. He knew that the Tsang-Qing divine kingdom could not be defended anymore. Many years ago, Boswell had devoted himself to research and did not pay enough attention to the battle. Although his many years of combat instincts were still there, when faced with such a high-intensity battle, he could not keep up with the rhythm at all. The whole scene was being played by Gu Nan. Just as Austin had expected, losing his divine body once again caused great damage to Boswell. It almost caused him to lose control of his god nation. Soon, Tsang-Qing god nation fell. Once again, their attempt failed. No one had expected that Gu Nan would be able to take down Tsang-Qing divine nation, even though he was marked with the life and death mark. But that was it, because Gu Nan did not have the opportunity to conquer the remaining two divine kingdoms. Whether it was Daisy or Austin himself, they had absolute power in the divine kingdom and could easily hit the mark of life and death. Oh, and there was also Eugene, the Lord of War. He still had a complete divine kingdom, but no one had the time to care about him. As for Bayer and Boswell, they had already gone to the light and darkness divine kingdoms respectively. Since the Tsang-Qing divine kingdom had fallen, Austin and Daisy could stay in their respective divine kingdoms. There was no safer place than the two divine kingdoms. After conquering the Tsang-Qing divine kingdom, Gu Nan retreated from the Pantheon world. As a veteran player who had completed his third job transition, Gu Nan knew very well that the closer he got to the god-slaying stage, the stronger the defense would be. Of course, to a level 14 player, this difficulty was nothing. It was the life and death mark that caused some trouble for Gu Nan. After forcefully wiping out the Tsang-Qing divine kingdom, he was not in a hurry to continue his invasion. He was not in a hurry to find Fu Qing. Now he needed a surefire plan to get rid of the weakness of the life and death mark. If he could not get rid of it completely, then treating the symptoms and not the root of the problem was also feasible. In the Pantheon world, there was a way to treat the symptoms. I want Fa Kong's life. Gu Nan did not hesitate and immediately stated his goal. Jiu Po's face was expressionless. Even though a portion of his maxim had been left in the Pantheon world, it was not to the extent that he had completely lost his combat power. Lu Wen looked at Gu Nan with amusement and asked, why? He had followed Jiu Po there before, but in the end, he did not show himself. His absolute strength was insufficient. His original intention was to hide in the dark and attack, but he did not expect that he would not have the chance to do so. Gu Nan said calmly, I need a tool that can nullify Maxim attacks from the front. Fa Kong Sarira should be able to do this. If it was a normal cultivator, they would definitely not use such strange descriptions as tool and nullify attacks. However, when it came to Gu Nan, the two of them did not find it strange at all. Gu Nan was not a normal person to begin with. I thought that Fa Kong had offended you all those years ago, and you finally remembered to take revenge. Lu Wen shook his head and said, back then, Monk Fa Kong had regarded Gu Nan as an evil demon. He had joined forces with Immortal Dream, Hua Kuei, and Song Fei, gathering the power of 4 Unification Path cultivators in an attempt to seal Gu Nan. In the end, at the cost of losing a large amount of Immortal Dream's Maxim, as well as the destruction of Monk Fa Kong's personal treasure, they had finally managed to seal most of Gu Nan's Maxim. However, in the end, a short 5 years later, Gu Nan had brought along his recovered body and killed his way to 3 Buddha Heaven to retrieve his Maxim. Fa Kong's Sarira can indeed be used to create defensive artifacts. Jiupa said, but do you know how to forge artifacts? I don't. Gu Nan said matter-of-factly. All of you mighty beings have lived for tens of thousands of years. There must be one who knows how to forge artifacts, right? Lu Wen smiled and said, there is indeed a master of artifact forging among the Unification Path cultivators, but he might not be willing to help you. Who? Song Fei. Gu Nan thought for a moment and said, he will help. 3 Buddha Heaven. More accurately, it should be the ruins of 3 Buddha Heaven, because this place was already a wasteland. After the battle came to an end, only a small number of Buddhist disciples had once again gathered here. Gu Nan, who had returned from the world of gods, had single-handedly destroyed a great god nation. His battle achievements had once again spread throughout the heavens. Everyone had personally witnessed his rise from his debut to his attainment of Unification Path, and finally his path to the pinnacle of the world. With Gu Nan's current strength and status, even among the Unification Path cultivators, he was a top-notch existence. This could be seen from the fact that his astral realm was still unscathed. Fa Kong had a deep understanding of this. Therefore, when Gu Nan appeared in front of him, he did not wait for Gu Nan to speak and had already admitted defeat and apologized. Ba. I was reckless back then, Fa Kong said with his palms pressed together. Almsgiver. There's no need to apologize. I'm here to get something from you today. Gu Nan's figure slowly walked out of the void and arrived in front of Fa Kong. Fa Kong began to have a bad premonition, but he still forced himself to calm down and said, Almsgiver, you are now fighting a strong enemy for the heavens. If you want to borrow something from me, I can. Chapter 543. Read. At this point, Monk Fa Kong actually didn't have much strength to fight back in front of Gu Nan. When Gu Nan had been at the 12th level, Fa Kong had been able to block a few punches with his secret technique. Now, he could not even block a single punch. Even Austin had been killed instantly when he was hit by the punch. How could Fa Kong be an exception? After losing the astral realm, Tao integration practitioners would be isolated from the laws again. They would no longer be able to obtain the direct protection of the laws and would only be left with their original bodies in the world. When their original bodies were destroyed, Tao integration practitioners would be completely erased from the world. After Fa Kong's head exploded, Gu Nan walked over unhurriedly and took out the Buddhist relic from the pool of blood. As a Tao integration Buddhist cultivator, Fa Kong's Buddhist relic was very strange. It looked simple and old, but it was spotless. It was clearly taken out of blood, but it was not tainted by any filth, as if nothing in the world could fall on it. When Fa Kong fell, several figures quickly landed there. They were led by Yu Lian and Jiupa. When a battle between Tao integration experts occurred, even a momentary fluctuation was enough to be detected by all Tao integration practitioners. At this critical juncture where every bush and tree was an enemy, the slightest movement would attract the attention of others. Yu Lian looked at Gu Nan silently, not knowing what to say. Another Tao integration practitioner had died at the hands of Gu Nan. They could have become an important force against the world of gods and were also the core of the heavenly world. However, Yulian couldn't bring herself to criticize Gu Nan. Because at this moment, Gu Nan wasn't someone they could go against since a long time ago. Just like back then, when Jiupe had beaten Elder Zi Luo to the bottom of his realm, no one could say anything. Gu Nan looked at the people who had come and found that Song Fei was also among them. This saved him the trouble of looking for Song Fei. Old Song, Gu Nan shouted in that direction. This strange form of address sent a chill down Song Fei's spine. He did not know what Gu Nan wanted to do. Then, he saw the latter slowly walking over. Yulian hurriedly stood in front of Gu Nan and said, "Song Fei did offend you in the past, but I asked him for help. I don't want to hit people." Gu Nan interrupted her. He tossed the relic in his hand and said, "This relic helped me refine a defensive tool." After saying that, Gu Nan began to describe the characteristics of the required props, including size, protection, durability, overall strength, and so on. "Do you understand?" Gu Nan looked at Song Fei and asked after stating his requirements. Only then did Song Fei confirm that he had no intention to kill. He was slightly relieved and said with a strange expression, "Refining is just a small matter. However, this relic was taken from fellow Taoist Fa Kong, isn't it a bit? If you don't agree, I'll beat you to death." Gu Nan twisted his neck, making a crisp sound. Song Fei swallowed all the words he wanted to say. In the end, Song Fei naturally agreed to help. Moreover, with his realm and standard, he was completely capable of fulfilling all of Gu Nan's requests. However, it wasn't easy to refine a Dao integration stage magic tool, especially one that could withstand the attacks of a powerful being like Austin. Song Fei gave him at least 3 months, and at most half a year. This was because he had Fa Kong's relic as the main material, which greatly simplified the refining process. If it weren't for the fact that the level of the material was so high that it didn't require much tempering, the normal refining time of a Dao integration stage master would be more than hundreds of years. In just 3 months it might not be called refining at all, but just polishing the material and making it into a rough product. It was like forging an iron plate with a hammer and then saying that it was plate armor. After doing these things, Gu Nan didn't stay any longer and went to another place. He originally wanted to go back to the God Nation, but an unexpected message from Taoist Netherworld forced him to change his schedule and go to the Crack World first. Taoist Netherworld rarely sent messages to the outside world. On the one hand, he didn't want to expose his location, and on the other hand, he didn't have anyone to communicate with. However, this time, Taoist Netherworld didn't hide anything and directly sent the message to Gu Nan's God Nation. If it weren't for the urgency of the matter, he definitely wouldn't have done this. Gu Nan quickly arrived at the original realm, and sure enough, he saw Taoist Netherworld nearby. His face was a little serious and a little fanatical. "I found it." Taoist Netherworld's first words surprised Gu Nan. "I found another person who left the original realm." Jiupe said that he wanted to find the way home, but compared to Taoist Netherworld, who had been guarding the original realm for 10,000 years, his persistence was obviously nothing. After 10,000 years of persistence, Taoist Netherworld's persistence finally paid off. After Jiupe, Lu Wen, Taoist Netherworld himself, and Gu Nan, he found another one of his kind from the original realm. "Where?" Gu Nan raised his eyebrows and asked immediately. "The world of gods." Hearing these words, Gu Nan finally understood why Taoist Netherworld was so anxious to reveal this news to him. With the current state of affairs in the Pantheon world, the only one who could come and go as he pleased was himself. Gu Nan quickly got the information about his kind from Taoist Netherworld. Of course, this fellow countryman was not Fu Qing. Even if Fu Qing did not delay time and immediately recovered after leaving the original realm, it was impossible for him to rise in such a short time. Taoist Netherworld had established his own organizations and forces in both realms, and there was more than one. They constantly collected all kinds of information for him. Among these organizations, even the management did not know who the leader of the organization was and what purpose the organization was established with. However, to be able to be found by Taoist Netherworld among all living beings, his strength would not be too weak. He found a god who had not been promoted for long, but his resume was quite dazzling. A mortal born in a remote small plane, who called himself Morag, quickly grew into a true god who ignited the divine fire in less than 2 years. His every move seemed to be standing at the forefront of history, and he had the ability to predict the future. He smoothly eliminated his opponents and finally succeeded in walking on the altar. What allowed him to do such a thing? Gu Nan carefully flipped through all the information, refusing to let go of any detail. Although they were of the same kind, he knew that people of the same kind were not the same. Except for himself, everyone only knew about history, or the future direction of the world, without any additional abilities. Gu Nan himself was the opposite. He brought an evil god temple over, but he did not go to the history he knew. Instead, he came to a completely unfamiliar world. Chapter 544. Reading. Jiupu used his understanding of history to take the land and use it as the astral realm in advance. He almost became the number one person in all the worlds, and he sat there for tens of thousands of years. Until Gu Nan appeared. With the powerful evil god's temple, he caught up to Jiupu in just 100 years. If not for the existence of the life and death mark, he could now level the two worlds, and no one would be able to stop him. But in comparison, the process of Gu Nan's rise was clearly more dangerous. Without the ability to predict the future, it meant that nothing could be foreseen. It was not that Gu Nan had never encountered a life or death crisis, but he had tried his best to avoid it. Those with the ability to predict history would not be like this. As long as they did not court death like Zero, those who were slightly more cautious would not encounter too big of a crisis and could completely avoid it in advance. Even Gu Nan suspected that there were actually transmigrators like him, but most of them died on the path of their rise. Therefore, it was very important to confirm what kind of situation Morag was in. Gu Nan was not in a hurry to act. He did not want to alert the enemy for the time being. Instead, he flipped through Morag's resume bit by bit, including every step of his actions. This process was not complicated. After all, Morag had only risen to power for a little more than 2 years. There were only a few big moves that needed attention. From Morag's resume, he should be similar to Jiupu and Yellow Spring Taoist. He was a transmigrator with the ability to predict the future, but he did not have much direct help from the original realm. Every step of Morag's advancement could be seen for a reason. Although his actions were very directional, in the end, one would find that his goal was resources that could increase his power. On the other hand, there was something about Morag that did not fit with the era. He knew many abilities, moves, and techniques that did not belong to the current era. He also spoke some words that others could not understand. Perhaps even Morag himself did not notice these things, but the intelligence organization under Yellow Spring Taoist faithfully recorded all of them and reported them to the two of them. Indeed, it is very likely that he is the same kind. Gu Nan let out a long sigh. If he was not a transmigrator that he had never seen before, then he was undoubtedly from the original realm. It's not a possibility. It's a certainty. Taoist Netherworld revealed a strange smile when he heard this. He pointed to the original realm below and said, "I found where his previous life was. The Pantheon world." Morag looked at the brand new god kingdom and could not help but heave a sigh of relief. He finally felt a little more relaxed. The aesthetics of these natives who lived on the eve of the great catastrophe were too strange. If they were allowed to build their own buildings, Morag would not be able to live there. It had been 2 years since he transmigrated to this world. He had grown from a mortal to a god. This speed was unbelievably fast, But Morag was still not satisfied. If he was in the game in his previous life, his progress would definitely be faster. That's right, Morag came from the original realm. He had once played an online game called King of Pantheon, and the background of the game was exactly the same as this world. The time when Morag transmigrated was the same as when the players entered the game. The background of the game was that the seemingly peaceful Pantheon world was about to encounter the greatest catastrophe in its history. The terrifying evil god descended and slaughtered all the main god. Even though the two main gods of light and darkness sealed the evil god at the cost of their lives, the Pantheon world was still greatly damaged. Everything was waiting to be rebuilt. The strongest enemy was temporarily sealed, but the external enemies were still powerful. Everything required the players' hard work to build a home that belonged to the Pantheon world. This was the first expansion pack of the game after the players had passed the beginner stage, Evil God Armageddon. When Morag transmigrated, the game had already entered the 7th expansion pack. It was the time for the players to form their own guilds and prepare to counterattack the external enemies. Morag was the guild leader of the Rising Sun Guild, one of the 3 major guilds. He had taken the first kill of countless dungeons and world bosses, so he had a deep understanding of the game. King of Pantheon was a very interesting game. Most of the game's content was set after the Great Catastrophe, only before the evil god Armageddon. This gave the players some time to adapt. During this time, only the top players were allowed to become gods, and they would undoubtedly become the pillars of the players, leading the rest of the players forward. It was also because of this setting that Morag, a pure professional player, had the space to display his abilities instead of selling all the good stuff to the pay-to-win warriors. However, after the Great Catastrophe, most of the players would gradually grow into gods. They would build their homes while fighting against the external enemies. This was also the origin of the name King of Pantheon. Of course, fights between the players were also inevitable. The natural division between the light and darkness pantheons caused the players to be divided into 2 camps, and there had never been a lack of attacks between them. However, all of this no longer existed. Morag looked at the distant sky and could not help but sigh. Because in this world, he was the only player, and the responsibility of saving the world could only be left to him. It was indeed a happy thing not to have thousands of players fighting for resources, but it was also very difficult to rely on one's own strength to defeat a powerful external enemy. However, things had already come to this, and Morag could only do his best, and at the same time, unite all the forces that could be united. So, Your Highness Karina. With a faint smile on his face, Morag looked at Karina in front of him. Are you interested in my suggestion? Morag approached Karina of his own accord. He had to tie Karina to his chariot. This goddess of war would be the main force against the external enemies in the future. In fact, the name of the 3rd expansion pack of the game was called Rise of the God of War. Knowing the history of the game, Morag knew that getting in touch with Karina was one of the main plot lines. If he wanted to get her help, he had to stay by her side. In his previous life, there was a lucky guy who stayed by Karina's side when the day of catastrophe arrived, and he successfully persuaded her to face the evil gods. In the end, he received a super high friendship rating from the goddess of war. Therefore, in the 3rd expansion pack, this player became the well-deserved main character. While Morag was contacting Karina, he did not know that 2 figures were slowly descending into the origin realm. They were in a civilization called Tyravans. Morag mentioned the word Tyravans several times in his conversation with his subordinates. Judging from the context, it should be a place, the Netherworld priest said with a smile. Chapter 545. Reading. Tyravans was a specific word. It was a literal translation of what the civilization called itself. If one were to investigate the meaning of this pronunciation, it probably meant 3 stars. This was because the birthplace of the Tyravan civilization was 3 habitable planets that were relatively close to each other. Of course, even now, these 3 planets were the main residences of the Tyravans people. It was just that the Federation's territory was gradually expanding, and they no longer had the absolute position they had in the early years. Since the Yellow Spring Taoist had found Tyravans, he could not avoid investigating Morag. However, as he was not clear about the other party's past life, the progress of this investigation was not deep enough. The Yellow Spring Taoist informed Gu Nan with the intention of using his power to start with Morag in the world of Pantheon. Even though Gu Nan was more interested in the online game native to Tyravans, Pantheon. These two did not contradict each other because in the process of investigating Pantheon, Gu Nan easily confirmed who Morag was. More than 2 years ago, the guild master of the Rising Sun Sunset Guild, one of the 3 major guilds, suddenly disappeared. This caused a huge uproar in the gaming world. It was not until someone found news of him in real life that they found out that he had suddenly died in the game. The official explanation was that this player, whose real name was Zhou Xian, had a sudden cardiac arrest due to the influence of strong brain waves, which directly led to his death. After finding the guild master's information, Gu Nan could confirm that these two were indeed the same person without comparing Zhou Xian and Morag's experiences. Zhou Xian's game ID was Morag. A gamer. After confirming Morag's identity, the Yellow Spring Taoist could not help but reveal an expression that did not know whether to laugh or cry. It was not that he had not searched Tyravans before, but his main focus was on literature and movies, and he almost did not consider gaming. On one hand, it was because his understanding of people from the original realm basically came from the 9 spirits and himself. He only thought that he had observed history through a certain method, and never thought that he could personally participate in it. On the other hand, the popularity of King of Pantheon was far from exploding across the internet. At most, it had a group of passionate players, which was nothing compared to Gu Nan's previous life. After confirming Morag's identity, Gu Nan and Netherworld could confirm a lot of things. Firstly, Zhou Xian's disappearance and Morag's appearance were basically synchronized. Zhou Xian's disappearance happened more than 2 years ago. Then, after Zhou Xian's disappearance, Pantheon did not go offline. It was still running as usual, and the 8th expansion pack was about to end. So, this is the history of the future? Netherworld Taoist said in an incredulous tone as he slowly flipped through the game background of Pantheon. The background of King of Pantheon started when the world of Pantheon was invaded and the lords fought to the death against the foreign evil gods. In the eyes of Taoist Huang Quan, this was clearly the war between the 2 worlds that had happened not long ago. It's possible. Gu Nan was also watching this history, even though calling something that had yet to happen history gave people a strange feeling. This piece of history was quite accurate. It said that the evil god descended to destroy the world with unimaginable power that the lords could not resist at all. In the end, Death sacrificed himself and finally opened a hole in the evil god's body, which was also the evil god's only weakness. Although this description was very different from reality, the general meaning was not wrong. When this game was released 6 or 7 years ago, the background of the game had already been announced. In other words, the original realm could indeed predict the future. Interesting. Gu Nan smiled and made such an evaluation. Predicting the future was not a big deal. Compared to mysterious things like timelines and parallel worlds, Gu Nan preferred deduction theory. If the original realm could grasp enough information about the 2 worlds, it was entirely possible to derive this result through deduction. Moreover, there was no such thing as absolute inertia in history. Since additional factors appeared, history would inevitably be changed. In other words, from the moment Gu Nan saw this information, history had already changed. The subsequent history was also witnessed by Gu Nan. When the evil god descended again, Austin and Daisy paid the price of their own lives and finally succeeded in sealing the evil god. This process was not described in detail, and Gu Nan only had written information in hand, which was not enough for him to make some judgments. On the other hand, there was something else that he found strange. The 7th and 8th expansion packs were wrong. If the first 6 expansion packs had a certain basis and could be said to be accurate predictions, then from the 7th expansion pack onward, it was simply nonsense. The world was truly shaped into a group of demons. They had oriental power and humanoid forms, but they were not normal humans. This was too different from reality. We have to find the game designer, Gu Nan stood up and said. An online game had its operator, developer, game background, and the release of the expansion pack. The content undoubtedly came from the development team. Taoist Netherworld had no reason not to. He was also very interested in the question of how history was leaked. In a technology startup park, Huang Haoshan was nibbling on a white bun as he hurried into the company's entrance. He had been a game developer at Micromotion Entertainment for more than 10 years. He had experienced all the ups and downs of the past 10 years. Now that he was over 30, he was no longer as hot-blooded as he was back then. The current Huang Haoshan only wanted to hold on to the MMORPG pantheon and walk to the ends of the earth. Although he knew it was unlikely, he at least hoped that pantheon could be popular for a few more years. However, a game's lifespan was limited. This was something he knew from the time he started developing Pantheon. On this day, Huang Haoshan came to work as usual. However, when he walked into his office, he found 2 strangers waiting for him inside. The 2 of them were wearing sleek suits and did not look like scammers. Huang Haoshan hesitated. "You are Mr. Huang Haoshan?" One of them stood up and looked at him calmly. For some reason, the other person's gaze sent chills down Huang Haoshan's spine. He nodded subconsciously. "I'm Huang Haoshan. What can I do for you?" "We're from the FBI's 6th Special Operations Division," the person said seriously. "We're here today to understand something from you." Chapter 546. Read. That's right. Huang Haoshan nodded, looking at the 2 strangely. He had never heard of the 6th Special Operations Division. Although it sounded impressive, why would the FBI interfere with his game development? The man in the suit exchanged a look with the other man, then turned to look at him. "Are the background and content of the game completely original works by you?" Huang Haoshan's heart skipped a beat. Could it be that these 2 were here to investigate copyright infringement? Was there really something wrong with the game's background? Why, yes. Huang Haoshan wiped the cold sweat that was about to drip from his forehead and forced himself to speak. The man in the suit looked at his actions and suddenly smiled. He put a hand on his shoulder and said, "Then can you please tell me why the content from the 7th expansion pack onwards is completely different from the previous ones?" In Huang Haoshan's mind, it was as if a bomb had exploded. He finally confirmed that the other party did not come knocking on his door randomly, but had indeed obtained evidence. The cold expression of the suited man in front of him made Huang Haoshan imagine a police officer carrying him away. I'll confess," Huang Haoshan said without hesitation. In federal law, intentional copyright infringement and unintentional copyright infringement were 2 completely different things. The sooner he confessed, the more lenient he would be. "You might not believe me." Huang Haoshan looked at the 2, a little embarrassed. "The information about the game came from my head." Huang Haoshan never doubted the background of the 2 men in front of him. Perhaps the FBI was lying, but they would not lie if they could point out the abnormalities of the 7th and 8th expansion pack. The background of the entire Pantheon game was written by Huang Haoshan, and the last 2 expansion packs were naturally the same. However, very few people knew that he had copied the information in his head for the first 2 expansion packs, and that he had written the last 2 based on previous information. However, after so many years of game development, Huang Haoshan believed that the last 2 expansion packs had no problems, and that they were seamlessly connected to the first 2. It had been 2 years since the release of the expansion packs, and the players were still full of praise. No one had ever criticized the quality for dropping, so what other problems could there be? However, Huang Haoshan knew that there was someone who might have noticed the problem, and that was the original author of the information in his head. After Huang Haoshan narrated his experience, Gu Nan and Taoist Huang Quan looked at each other and were at a loss for words. No one would have thought that this precious information about the future of the two worlds outside had inexplicably appeared in the minds of some ordinary people. Gu Nan thought for a moment and asked, "You mean after the 6th expansion pack, there's no new information in your head?" "Yes." Huang Haoshan nodded. In the past, new information would automatically appear in July every year. However, there hasn't been any in the past 2 years. After saying this, Huang Haoshan hurriedly said, "Both of you, I didn't mean to plagiarize. I thought these were all, it's okay." Gu Nan smiled and patted him on the shoulder. "Don't tell anyone about what happened today." In a nearby tea house, Gu Nan and Taoist Huang Quan were sitting opposite each other. "Do you think this could be man-made?" Taoist Huang Quan pondered for a long time and suddenly said, he never thought that the truth would be so absurd. He subconsciously thought that there was a mastermind behind this and tried to analyze the other party's purpose. Gu Nan shook his head and said, "I'm not sure yet. And if it's man-made, there will be a better way to deal with it." It was too crude to directly stuff the information into the brain. Moreover, the mastermind behind the scenes was too nonsensical. What was his purpose in doing things in such a roundabout way? Gu Nan was more inclined to believe that this was a natural phenomenon that had yet to be discovered. Just like how Fu Qing was directly taken away, it was clearly a spontaneous action of the Bitwall. Now we have confirmed how the information about the future appeared, but why Morag? Gu Nan's thoughts quickly shifted to the next step. In addition to Lu Wen being brought out by Taoist Huang Quan, how Gu Nan and the others could leave the original realm was also a mystery. Taoist Huang Quan came to a realization and stood up, saying, "I'll stay here. We need more information to confirm Zhou Xian's uniqueness." The investigation continued with Zhou Xian and Morag, but it was mainly handed over to Taoist Huang Quan. Gu Nan went to the world of gods alone. He completely hid his tracks with shadows. Under the 14th grade rule of shadow, even the main gods would not be able to find him. He came near Morag's divine kingdom and quietly watched his movements. He also saw Karina leave. Gu Nan was not surprised that Morag was trying to get close to Karina. After all, he had already read Tyravin's information and knew what Karina would achieve in the future. In fact, he did not even need to read it to know. Karina's power and uniqueness had already been revealed in Gu Nan's era. However, what Gu Nan was really interested in was that since Morag had transmigrated through playing a game, was it possible that he had a related cheat? Although he and Taoist Huang Quan did not find anything special when they checked Morag's resume, it might be that Morag's ability was more secretive. After all, it sounded strange to light up the divine fire in 2 years. Anyway, there were still 3 months before Song Fei finished crafting. He could just quietly observe Morag's actions, of course. Just observing was not enough. Now, Morag's life was a little too comfortable. He couldn't force out his potential. If there were no difficulties, he could make them. The opportunity came very soon. On this day, Morag built his divine kingdom as usual, recruited believers from different planes, and carried out a treasure hunt at the same time. For a transmigrator who was familiar with history, building a divine kingdom step by step was a waste of knowledge. After making a plan for his divine kingdom, Morag quickly led his army out of the divine kingdom and came to a plane of dual ice and fire elements, Dylan. This was a dungeon in the game that would produce the blueprint of dual elemental soldiers. It was definitely a great help for Morag's divine kingdom. Before the army set off, Morag's deputy said, "Sir, it is said that Prince Wolf is protecting Dylan Plain. Don't worry." Morag smiled and waved his hand. Wolf, the wolf of ice and fire, is probably having a hard time protecting himself now. This is a great opportunity for us to attack Dylan. The deputy looked at Morag in confusion. He did not know where Morag got the information from, but because of such strange information, he had seen too many battles that eventually won. So, this time, he decisively chose to believe Morag. Chapter 547. Read. Wolf of Ice and Fire was one of the rarer gods. He was a xenogeneic god from the orcs. However, one should never underestimate this ice-fire two-headed wolf, just because he was a god from another race. In the wolf race, there were at least 80,000 people named Wolf. However, when wolf was mentioned, most people would think of this ice-fire two-headed wolf. One could imagine his status. However, Morag wasn't afraid at all. He knew very well that Wolf was facing the biggest crisis of his life and wouldn't have the time to rush over. Although Dylan was important to Wolf, what was more important than his own life? Morag's army arrived in Dylan in the blink of an eye. Under Morag's command, they quickly spread out and went to various resource points to plunder resources. Morag's main goal was the army blueprint, but he also needed to plunder other resources from Dylan. For a new god, believers and resources were equally important. As a player, it was obviously easier for Morag to plunder resources than to recruit believers. Everything was carried out in an orderly manner. After Morag completed his plan, he didn't pay any more attention to it. He didn't care about a mere Dylan at all. After all, he had become a main god in his previous life and even organized the players to fight back against the demons. This level of difficulty was child's play for him. Morag was already thinking about what he should do with the new army after he got the ice and fire elemental temple. Just as Morag expected, Wolf was facing a huge crisis. Although he received news that Dylan was attacked, he couldn't spare any time to deal with it. Wolf's crisis came from his own race, or more accurately, the wolf race. The wolf race was a very large race, and the Icefire two-headed wolves were only one of the smaller tribes. Wolf's strong rise caused the Icefire two-headed wolves to enter a state of prosperity. Naturally, they would encounter a lot of challenges from the wolf race. This was the current situation. Wolf was facing a young powerhouse from the Steel Wolf race. This Steel Wolf named Woolwolf had an extremely popular name like Woolwolf, and it also had a powerful strength similar to Woolwolf. The difference was that Wolf was good at the law of ice and fire, while Wolf was a pure lover of violence. All his strength came from his body. There was nothing much to describe about their battle. The name Worf filled the screen. However, the result of history was that Wolf of Ice and Fire won in the end. After a fierce battle that lasted for 2 months, he tore his opponent into pieces. However, he had paid a huge price. His godhead had been nearly shattered, and his body had been seriously injured. It took a long time for him to recover. Morag knew this, which was why he was so confident in attacking Dylan. However, Wolf did not die in the end. Hence, in King of Pantheon, all players who entered this dungeon would encounter Wolf's revenge in another side quest in the future. At this moment, Wolf had just been challenged, and the two dwarfs were fighting fiercely. Wolf focused all of his attention on what was in front of him. The ice and fire laws collided in midair, trying to force the fast-moving enemy to reveal himself. But then he saw an incredible scene. Steel Wolf stopped abruptly. Even when the ice and fire elements collided with his body, he did not move at all. Strangely, he stood still in the air as if time had stopped. Wolf was shocked by this scene. If not for the widened eyes of his opponent and the frozen expression on his face, he would have thought that this was a trick of his opponent. After a while, the body of the Steel Wolf began to break into pieces. His skin peeled off piece by piece, followed by his flesh, tissues, and organs. In the blink of an eye, Wolf had become a pile of broken pieces, soaked in sticky blood. Even as a god, Wolf had never seen such a strange way of dying. This reminded him of the undead gods who toyed with corpses. Did his opponent offend a certain lord from the Dark Pantheon before he challenged him? Wolf did not have time to think. Since his opponent was already dead, he did not dare to stay any longer. He quickly left the place where the two of them fought. After His Highness the two-headed wolf of ice and fire returned, the first place he went to was of course Dylan, the dimension that was being attacked by his enemies. "Hurry up, you lazy bums! Don't forget that we're at war." The deputy whipped a soldier and yelled. Due to the thick armor on his body, the soldier did not feel any pain. Instead, he grinned at his deputy and hurriedly ran to the front. It was not that he was not vigilant enough. It was just that, under the arrangement of the Lord, the entire Dylan seemed to be defenseless. This made the soldiers think that their opponent was only SOSO. On almost all the battlefields, they always had more people than the enemy and formed a perfect formation to fight against the enemy. This was something that Gu Nan could not do. He was good at fighting alone. And for Morag, who used to be a guild leader, it was too easy for him to do this. "Robert, don't be nervous." Morag walked over from the back and patted the deputy's shoulder. "Wolf won't be able to gather his men for at least 2 months. Robert, the deputy, still looked serious. "It's not a bad thing to hurry up." Morag shrugged indifferently and did not intend to persuade him any further. The reason why he chose Robert as his assistant was because of his steadiness. "If that's the case, why don't you?" Before Morag could finish his sentence, he suddenly raised his head and looked at the sky in surprise. In the unclear sky of Dylan, 2 clouds of mist began to condense. One was ice and the other was fire. Finally, Wolf's figure appeared. The moment the wolf-headed wolf appeared, the morale of Dylan's side was greatly boosted. The various battlefields immediately began to counterattack. "Lord!" Wolf appeared. "Lord!" Robert also saw this scene and said to Morag anxiously. Morag stared blankly at the sky and was momentarily speechless. He could not understand why Wolf would appear at this time, and he did not look injured at all. His first reaction was that history was wrong, but his experience in the past 2 years told him that history could not be wrong. Could it be that one of his previous actions had affected the course of history and caused the Steel Wolf to not challenge Wolf? Chapter 548. Read. In order to seize the most resources, Morag used the most extensive strategy for the arrangement of his army. He used every bit of power to the extreme to ensure the highest efficiency in plundering resources. This was a rather brilliant strategy, but when Wolf returned to Dylan, this strategy became the death knell for Morag's army. The only way now is to kill Wolf. Morag looked at the sky coldly. Wolf seemed to have noticed his gaze and slowly shifted his gaze. Wolf was a god with rich experience in divine wars. He knew that he had the absolute advantage, so even if he found the enemy, he was not in a hurry to act. After all, the incident today was too strange. The mysterious death of Steel Wolf made him feel that someone was manipulating everything behind the scenes. He did not want to act rashly. However, no matter what Wolf thought, Morag had no way out. He had to kill Frostfire Two-Headed Wolf. "Sir, what are you going to do?" Robert looked at Morag in despair. He could not imagine how the latter, who had just advanced, could fight Wolf. His Highness Frostfire Two-Headed Wolf was a powerhouse who could fight a level 7 god. Morag did not say a word. He knew that Wolf was waiting for him to make the first move and reveal an opening, but he had no other choice. If that's the case, Morag made up his mind. With a slight thought, a ray of light began to flash in his spirit sense. The next moment, a series of data appeared on his retina. This was something that only he could see. If there were people who had played King of Pantheon, they would be very familiar with this data. In the game, this had a name that all players were familiar with, the skill panel. That's right, although he could not transmigrate with the entire game system, he brought Morag a skill panel. Of course, a single skill panel was not as powerful as the evil god's shrine. However, since Morag was familiar with history, the combination of the two gave him a huge advantage. He could always make the best choice, and at the same time, he had the ability to explode with super high combat power. On the other hand, because the skill tree did not affect Morag's actual realm, this improvement was hard to see from the outside. Therefore, very few people noticed his abnormality. The only thing a skill tree could really affect was combat power. A crazed look appeared on Morag's face. He added all the experience gained from killing monsters in the past into one skill. That was his favorite swordsmanship in his previous life. It was also a swordsmanship that only those who had reached the realm of gods were qualified to use. Its name was Divine Punishment. The Divine Punishment sword technique wasn't very powerful in the early stages, but once the skill's level was high, it would have unexpected effects. Level 1, Level 2, Level 3. With the continuous infusion of skill experience, Morag leveled up the Divine Punishment swordsmanship to Level 10 in the blink of an eye. Level 10 was the limit of what he could do in this realm. If he continued to improve, he would reach the level of a Lord God, which was not something Morag could control at all. But even a Level 10 swordsmanship was far beyond Morag's current realm. After activating the skill, Morag's body slowly floated into the sky and stared at Wolf in the air. For a close combat swordsman like him, fighting in the air was actually disadvantageous. On the other hand, Wolf's ice and fire rule was not affected. But Morag couldn't care less. He knew that he only had the power for one attack. His divine power could only support him for one strike. After one strike, it was either succeed or die. Wolf didn't even have time to speak before he saw the enemy in front of him suddenly swing his sword. A golden light cut through the sky and instantly slashed at him. This strike was as fast as lightning, and all of Wolf's rules were instantly cut through. He stared blankly at the golden light in front of him, and then he lost consciousness. In the eyes of the others, Wolf was directly hit by the golden light, and a golden line appeared between his eyebrows. Then, his body slowly collapsed and fell from the sky. After doing all this, Morag also fell from the sky as if all his strength had been sucked out. His deputy, Robert, hurriedly went up to catch him. Fortunately, Morag was only pale, and he was still conscious. It was because he had overexerted his divine power. Morag struggled to prop himself up and said to Robert, "Everything will go according to plan." Morag heaved a sigh of relief when he successfully killed Wolf. Fortunately, he still had the skill panel. However, at this moment, he saw Robert looking behind him in horror as if he had seen a ghost. Morag suddenly turned around, only to see an unfamiliar figure standing behind him, looking at him with great interest. "Who are you?" Morag asked subconsciously. He quickly flipped through his memories, trying to find the corresponding role of the person in front of him, but to no avail. The person did not speak. He only looked at him with a smile, and then waved his hand gently, completely erasing Morag's consciousness. When he woke up again, Morag found himself in a secret room. The secret room was completely isolated from the outside world, making it impossible for him to determine the time and location. Under the dim light, there was not a single person around, much less any landmark. His divine power was completely sealed by a special force. Frowning, Morag stood up and carefully looked around. Then, he found a book on the table next to him. The cover of the book was blank, and there was no name on it. However, the contents of the book shocked Morag. Written on it was his complete resume, from when he came to this world inexplicably to when he climbed up step by step. "Curious, are you? Why would we collect information about you?" A voice came from in front of him, with a hint of mockery. Morag looked up and saw a figure wrapped in a black robe standing in front of him. It was the person he had seen earlier. "Who the hell are you?" Morag said sternly. He had a bad feeling in his heart. It seemed that he had been targeted by some force. "Welcome to the Transmigrator Alliance," the black-robed man said with a smile. "You can call me Goo." "Oh, I mean Goo." Morag looked at the man who called himself Goo in front of him. He was no longer in the mood to care about his name. All his attention was attracted by those 5 words. Transmigrator Alliance. You mean, that's right. Gunan nodded. There are many transmigrators like you and me. We gathered together to form this alliance, and then recruited more transmigrators from all over the world. Chapter 549. Read. The Transmigrator Alliance. These 5 words were deeply imprinted in Morag's mind. When Morag walked out of the secret room, he was greeted by a vast expanse of white. This seemed to be a military base, and there were staff hurrying about everywhere. All of them wore white coats. Morag had only seen this style in his past life, and it was definitely not a product of the Pantheon world. Is this really the Transmigrator Alliance? Looking at this scene, Morag could not help but believe Ancient's words a little. Ever since he transmigrated, nothing in this world had exceeded his expectations, until he met Ancient and the Transmigrator Alliance today. Moreover, Ancient had said that he would bring him to test his ability? Could it be that every transmigrator has their own unique ability? As if reading Morag's mind, Gu smiled and said. Morag thought to himself, if that was the case, his ability should be the skills panel. We've seen your information, but it was only after you killed Wolf that we confirmed that you're a transmigrator. Ancient looked at Morag and said, your ability seems to allow you to master some unknown moves. Morag nodded and said, that's right. This is a power from my past life. Even though he gradually believed Ancient's words, Morag did not lose his basic vigilance and was foolish enough to reveal everything about himself. Ancient did not say anything else. He only brought Morag to a laboratory and said to him, use your ability here. We will test the basic strength and level of your ability. Morag looked at him doubtfully and asked, can abilities be graded? Of course. Ancient laughed involuntarily. Transmigrators' abilities are divided into 7 levels according to their type and strength. The highest is S level, and the lowest is F level. Morag's heart skipped a beat and he asked, then what level do you think my ability is at? He knew that Ancient had brought him here, so he must have made a judgment of his ability. On the other hand, he also planned to use Ancient's judgment to determine how strong his ability should be. He had obtained an entire skill tree. If the so-called ability referred to ordinary abilities, how could it compare to his own? However, Gu only said calmly, its strength might reach B rank, and its ability type is E rank at most. Morag couldn't help but widen his eyes. He couldn't believe that his ability evaluation was so low. Since he was able to kill Wolf with a single strike, he shouldn't be considered weak, right? In the face of his expression, Gu only smiled and explained, only the ability to kill enemies of a higher level can be ranked above. As for the type of ability, your ability doesn't support your realm at all, so you won't be able to go far. Hearing that, Morag could not help but fall silent. With his previous life's experience, he naturally knew the importance of the realm. He might be able to kill Wolf with a random skill, but that was only because the enemy's realm was too low. If he was up against a 10th order opponent, he wouldn't have much of an advantage in terms of skills. From this perspective, it wasn't wrong for Gu to rate his ability type as rank E. Then let's begin, Morag said solemnly after putting away the contempt in his heart. He walked into the lab and allowed the staff to set up some testing equipment. Then, he saw one of them nod at him, indicating that he could begin. Morag took a deep breath and activated his ability according to the instructions. The skill tree in his brain began to take shape, and the data of the skill also began to appear on his retina. Outside the lab, Gu Nan stood in front of a computer and watched the data change on it. The so-called Transmigrator Alliance was, of course, a lie made up by Gu Nan. In reality, Morag had been unconscious for more than a month. It wasn't until the setup was completed that Gu Nan woke him up. This set of equipment came from Milky Way Sky. Gu Nan had personally asked Si Yun for it. It could clearly reflect the material changes in the target's body, and even the real-time position could be displayed. When Morag activated his ability, the screen impressively showed that in his brain there was an unprecedented substance being rapidly secreted. Number 059812, what substance is this? The equipment had already analyzed its characteristics and found the corresponding substance from the list of substances. Gunan looked at the results and asked. A staff member got up with a head full of sweat and kept searching in another table. If it was an ordinary substance, the equipment itself would give the result. But now there was only a number, which meant that this was a substance that had not been completely determined. 0.59 this is. The staff member found the meaning of the number and could not help but be shocked. A specific ratio of world source. World source. Gunan was stunned. He did not expect Morag's body to secrete such a thing. The equipment in Milky Way sky used the common material names of all the heavens. 0.59 represented all world source, and the 812 behind it was this specific ratio of number. World source was not a very rare thing. There were so many planes in the heavens, and each had its own world source. These world sources had certain similarities, but they also had their own special characteristic. So, at the end of the day, each world source had its own specific ratio. Of course, for most people, this subtle difference was completely meaningless. No matter what ratio it was, it would not affect the use of world source. However, at this time, Gunan suddenly thought of another possibility. Could number 059812 be the original realm source? Could it be that the transmigrators who left the original realm were caused by the original realm source? These thoughts flashed through Gunan's mind, and he said with a serious face, "Let him activate his ability again and see if this phenomenon is stable." The staff member quickly nodded in agreement. After a few rounds of testing, they finally got a confirmation. As long as Morag activated his ability, his brain would automatically secrete world source, and it was also number 059812. But the amount of this world source that appeared was determined by the strength of Morag's ability. Gunan looked at this result, thought for a moment and said, "Can we create this world source ourselves?" "Of course, sir." The person on the seat smiled. "As long as you know the number, any world source can be created." "All right." Gunan nodded. "Create this world source, stop Morag's ability, and then inject the world source into his head." This sounded a little scary, but the researchers who came from the laboratory were already used to it. In their eyes, Morag was just a research subject. Chapter 550. Read. What's this for? Morag raised his head in confusion and looked at the catheter floating steadily above his head. He believed that no matter what they were testing, they would not use a tool like a catheter. They were clearly going to pour something into his body. "Goo! What are you trying to do?" Morag began to yell outside the laboratory. He panicked once again. However, the next moment, he felt his body tighten. A mechanical arm was stuck on his neck, making him unable to say a word. Morag knew that things were not good and quickly interrupted his skill interface. In his opinion, if the other party had any intentions towards him, it was most likely due to his special ability. Only by hiding his secret would he have the capital to negotiate. However, when Morag was unable to move, the catheter swooped down and pierced the back of his neck, accurately stuck between his two vertebrae. Immediately after, Morag felt a chill rush up his spine and into his head. Something terrifying happened. Morag felt as if his skill interface had completely gone out of control. Countless data flew in front of his eyes, and the skill experience points that he had left increased at a terrifying rate. After more than 2 years of accumulation, the total skill experience points he had accumulated did not exceed 200,000. However, in just an instant, the number of experience points had exceeded 1 billion. Look at what's written on his retina. Gunan's voice sounded calmly. Under the close monitoring of the experimental device, all changes in Morag's body could not be hidden. Gu Nan and the rest could clearly see that as a large amount of origin surged in, some data was directly projected onto Morag's retina. Yes. The researcher quickly responded and began to operate the device again. Therefore, under Morag's horrified gaze, a small scalpel fell and instantly pierced into his head, accurately cutting off his pain nerves. Morag only felt a chill in his head, and an indescribable fear began to rise in his heart. He did not know what these people were trying to do. But what happened next was even more terrifying. The scalpel cut from the top of his skull all the way to his brow bone. A mechanical hand reached in and pulled his head open, revealing the internal structure and the target of Gu Nan and the others, Morag's left eyeball. Another mechanical hand slowly reached over and carefully pushed the optic nerve to the side. It took out Morag's left eyeball and connected it to the detection device. In Morag's undamaged right eye, one could even see that his left eye was still connected to his nerve. Blood was dripping from it, but he could no longer feel pain. The scene outside the laboratory was still as calm as ever. No one cared about this child's actions at all. For a God-level test subject, this kind of injury was nothing. After taking out the eyeball, the image Morag saw quickly appeared in front of Gu Nan through the analysis of the eyeball and retina. Skill panel. Gu Nan could not help but raise his eyebrows. He did not expect Morag to obtain this. Gu Nan had also seen gods before, so of course he would recognize them. Adjust the rate of input from the origin and see what changes are happening to his body when the panel is operating. Skills could not be obtained out of thin air. It had to be a reaction from Morag's body. Understood. The researcher nodded again, but then said, "But sir, this may take some time." Under the strict monitoring of high-precision instruments, every change in Morag's body was clearly seen. In the clean white laboratory, there was only the sound of machinery swaying and muscles being cut, but Morag still could not move. He could only watch as the scalpel fell again and again, incising various parts of his body and exposing the changes in his muscles and bones. The testing process did not last too long. Or rather, it was just a skill panel. There was not much to test. After finding the ratio of the world's origin, it was a piece of cake for the laboratory to adjust the changes in the skill panel through the input rate, ratio, and other factors. Almost without much effort, the laboratory had completely mastered the control of the panel. However, the effect of the origin on Morag's body was a very strange process. Under the monitoring of the device, the world's origin was converted through a special method. On the one hand, it was improving part of Morag's body, and on the other hand, it was directly stimulating his brain. It seemed to be using this method to input the memory of the relevant skills into his brain. About half an hour later, the laboratory could already control the improvement of Morag's skills. So, Gu Nan ordered, increase his divine punishment swordsmanship to level 15. Among all of Morag's skills, the divine punishment swordsmanship that he had just used was the highest level. In the past, he had not been so extravagant as to put all his skill experience into a single swordsmanship. One had to know that Morag's skill panel included most life skills. This could greatly increase the speed at which he built his holy kingdom. Yes, sir. The researcher in front of the experiment table immediately did as he was told. The world's origin kept pouring in, and Morag only saw the data on his skill panel jump up again. In fact, his experience had long overflowed. The data was so large that the panel could not fit it all, but it was not easy to add all this experience to his skills. Increasing skills was essentially a process of strengthening Morag's body and memory. The speed of strengthening was limited by Morag himself. Sir, the target's body is not strong enough. His level 11 swordsmanship has already reached the level of Tao integration, but the speed is very slow. The researcher immediately reported to Gu Nan. How long will it take? Gu Nan asked after thinking for a while. It'll take at least half a month to reach level 11. It might be faster after that. It was the most complicated to advance from the mortal level to the Lord level, but the subsequent advancements were not as troublesome. Continue, Gu Nan ordered. Under his control, Morag couldn't resist much, and he didn't lack the time to do so. Instead, Morag's experience started to give him some ideas. Since the world's origin number 059812 could increase skill experience, could it directly increase his sin value? After leaving Morag's laboratory, Gu Nan walked into another laboratory. There was another set of the same equipment here, but there was no other Morag. This was prepared for Gu Nan himself. Gu Nan walked into the laboratory, and the catheter was inserted into Gu Nan's body, just like how Morag did. The world's origin also started to enter his body. Actually, Gu Nan did not need the help of any equipment to clearly see the changes in his body. Chapter 551. Read. When the world's origin number 059812 entered Gu Nan's body, he did not feel much, and his sin value did not change at all. However, strangely, the evil god's temple, which was connected to Gu Nan's divine soul, shone brightly due to the injection of the origin. In the divine kingdom, the evil god's temple had always been sitting quietly in the center of the divine kingdom, unaffected by anything. However, on this day, everyone in the divine kingdom could see the evil god's temple suddenly exploding with a shocking light, making the sky of the divine kingdom a deep blue. The people who were originally in the evil god's temple were directly thrown out by a force, and the evil god's temple itself began to shrink rapidly. In just a moment, the evil god's temple shrank to an extremely small state, and then left the divine kingdom, escaping into the void. This is... Red Tail happened to be in the divine kingdom, and she could not help but be dumbfounded when she saw this. I've already informed teacher. Yen Xiaoxiao's voice sounded beside her, and at the same time she appeared. Hearing Yen Xiaoxiao's words, Red Tail could not help but heave a sigh of relief. She knew what kind of existence Yen Xiaoxiao was, and since she was fine, the divine kingdom itself should not be affected much. Did Master reply? Red Tail asked immediately. Yen Xiaoxiao shook her head lightly, and did not speak, but there was an inexplicable worry in her eyes. This time, the disappearance of the evil god's temple made her feel as if Gu Nan had been cut off from the divine kingdom. Although the two were still connected, they were no longer as inseparable as before. Gu Nan stood in the laboratory, looking at the scene in front of him curiously. With Gu Nan's power, of course, no one could restrict him. In fact, even the speed at which the origin was injected into his body was actually controlled by him, and the device was only providing him with the origin. However, when the origin entered his body, he found that his brain was also stimulated, but the sin value interface did not change. Instead, the evil god's temple inexplicably left the divine kingdom and appeared in front of him. At this time, the evil god's temple was small and exquisite, different from the huge building that occupied thousands of miles in the divine kingdom. It was as small as a model, and could be held with one hand. However, Gu Nan could see that it was fully equipped. Everything that should be in the evil god's temple was there. In fact, this scene was not unfamiliar to Gu Nan, as he had seen it when he was playing the game in his previous life. When a player underwent their third promotion, the evil god's temple would leave God's kingdom and appear before the player. The temple would then shatter itself, becoming a sacrifice for the player's third promotion. This scene was filled with the feeling of an evil ritual, as if it meant that the player would become an independent existence. Many players who had completed their third transition saw this scene as a design to sublimate the theme of the game. However, Gu Nan knew that there must be a special meaning behind this. King, although many monsters Nan not had the not was not. Gu Nan is Nan, God, world was, God, God, the special world origin did have an effect on Gu Nan, but this effect did not affect him. Instead, it affected the evil god's palace. This was the first time that Gu Nan's evil god's temple and God's temple were different. Why? Gu Nan was puzzled, but he didn't do anything. He simply waited for the evil God's temple's reaction. The next moment, just as Gu Nan had expected, the evil God's temple exploded, turning into fragments that fused with Gu Nan's body. The game interface in Gu Nan's mind gradually shattered, and his God's temple was split in half. Everything was the same as the third-class advancement in the game. However, Gu Nan could clearly feel that he hadn't truly reached the third-class advancement yet. I'm still lacking. Is it because I'm lacking some God's temple? This state gave Gu Nan the feeling that he already had the characteristics of the third-class advancement, but he hadn't reached it in terms of quantity. However, by going through the third-class advancement in advance, Gu Nan no longer had God's temple. He had even lost the evil God's temple. Without the evil God's temple, would he still have God's temple? Gu Nan didn't experiment for the time being. He continued to inject the world's origin into his body, but it was useless. What does that mean? Could it be that I'm not the one who transmigrated, but the evil God's temple? This funny thought flashed past Gu Nan's mind. He was originally just mocking himself, but he couldn't forget it. Based on the current situation, this seemed to be the answer that was closest to the truth. Morag had transmigrated because the skill interface was one with him. In other words, it was an ability that belonged to him, and the skill interface was just a form of display. If it was in a different mode, it could be a skill tree, a library in his head, or an ability that added skill points. It didn't matter. But Gu Nan was different. His power actually came from the evil God's temple. What he did before was to first help the evil God's temple improve, and then let the evil God's temple nourish him. Of course, because the evil God's temple had no consciousness and was completely under Gu Nan's control, he didn't feel that there was anything wrong with it. Until today, when the evil God's temple was broken because of its own rules, Gu Nan finally understood the difference. The world's origin is the embodiment of the world's rules. As long as there is enough power of the rules, they can create anything. Of course, that includes the evil God's temple. With Gu Nan's current realm, he had a very deep understanding of the world's origin. The so-called origin could be understood as the basic energy that assembled everything. As long as the outside world gave the format of everything, it could be created with the origin. Morag's skill interface was such a format. So when he obtained the origin of the original realm, this format was immediately activated and put to use. If he couldn't get support from the outside world, he could only produce and sell it on his own. Fortunately, this format itself contained a way to produce the origin. The skill interface gained experience from killing monsters, and the evil God's temple gained sin points through various methods. As for why this format appeared, the reason was simple. This format originally came from the original realm. Perhaps only a suitable format would be effective in the outside world. If that was the case, maybe Jiu-Pa, Taoist Netherworld, and the others also had this format, but they couldn't activate it? I need to do another experiment. Thinking of this, Gu Nan immediately realized that he needed more experimental cases. But it was too late to find Fu Qing now, and it was difficult to get Taoist Netherworld and Jiu-Pa to cooperate. Lu Wen, a fake, could not fully explain the problem. Chapter 552. Read. Ever since he captured Morag, Gu Nan's research on the original realm had progressed by leaps and bounds. Especially compared to Priest Netherworld, the research and observation of tens of thousands of years might not be as reliable as a few hours of Gu Nan's experiment. Of course, this could only mean one thing. Practice was the only standard to test the truth. With such illogical thoughts, Gu Nan quickly descended to the core of the heavenly world, the inner world created by the second-generation saint. The inner world was a very special existence. It was completely built by humans, but its purpose was to serve the entire heavenly world. And in the inner world, there was an even more special person. That was the woman who also came from the original realm, but her will had been erased, and she remained here for life. "Welcome back, my king." Zero's voice was the same as before, as if it would not change even after tens of thousands of years. Gu-Nan raised his head and looked at the figure that emitted a blue glow, but he did not speak. He just calmly came in front of her and slowly poured a bottle of medicine into Zero's body. This was, of course, the source of the original realm that had been adjusted. As the source of the world, the source of the original realm did not seem to be much different from the outside world. It was even a specific ratio that was within the range of serial numbers. But when it was used on a transmigrator like Zero, a strange change occurred. Zero's originally blue body shone with silver light. It seemed that some kind of ability was acting out of her control, producing an unexpected effect. Energy absorption, 100% charged. System activated. The voice sounded in Zero's head. "This is the system?" Gu-Nan watched the silver light finally fall and could not help but laugh. With Gu-Nan's current realm, the system's voice could not be hidden from him. But even though the system was activated, Zero still did not seem to have regained her consciousness. She just looked at Gu-Nan again and said, "As you command, my king." Detected that the host's consciousness is damaged. Repair? The system's voice sounded again, but Zero did not seem to hear it. The answer is yes. Gu-Nan made the decision for Zero. Yes. Command confirmed. System repair in progress, insufficient energy. Repair failed. When Gu-Nan heard this, he immediately poured 2 more test tubes of source into her body. He had nothing to worry about. With his current strength, he was not afraid of anyone at all. Moreover, he was the only one who knew the ratio of the origin of the original realm. System repairing. System repairing. Repair successful. After a while, a different voice finally sounded. Zero's blue energy body suddenly condensed and turned into a real human figure. His eyes became lively, but he looked at Gu-Nan with vigilance. "Who are you? Where am I?" Gu-Nan looked at him and smiled. "Do you still remember who you are?" Zero opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. In the end, he shook his head in distress. The so-called system repair was more like reformatting her entire body. "Come with me." Gu-Nan shook his head and did not say anything more. He brought Zero into the lab. A moment later, Zero suffered the same fate as Morag. Her body was completely immobilized, and all kinds of instruments were attached to her body. The changes in her body were faithfully displayed on the screen. "It's very similar to the first experiment subject, sir," the researcher said excitedly. He had never seen such a strange situation. 2 completely different people, but they had similar and powerful abilities. Compared to Morag, Zero's ability was undoubtedly more comprehensive and powerful. The system in her body could perform any operation on her body, and it could even forcibly upgrade her body. In the observation in the lab, this ability undoubtedly belonged to Zero. The system was more like her own imagination, and it was also just a form of display. During the experiment, through the input of the source 059812, Zero's genes could even be changed, turning her from a human to a beast and then back again. Of course, she could also perfectly turn into another person. In a sense, these transmigrators are actually a type of mental patient, Gu-Nan concluded. But he knew very well that he did not belong to this category. Because the evil god temple really existed, and it even had the ability to create things out of thin air. The early equipment was not fake. But I also come from the original realm. What's the difference between me and these transmigrators? Gu-Nan frowned and thought. He did not doubt the origin of his spiritual soul. Not only because of his memories, but also because his body was affected by the spiritual soul. His appearance was actually getting closer to his previous life. These details all proved that Gu-Nan's spiritual soul did indeed come from the blue planet, but he did not have the characteristics of a transmigrator, or rather, the characteristics that should have belonged to him had fallen on the evil god temple. Continue to give her the source. Gu Nan had some guesses in his mind, but they had not been confirmed yet. Adjust his body in the direction of rules. Yes, the researcher replied firmly. He knew what he was doing. He was very likely to witness the first man-made path fusing. He took 0 away. Yulian's voice sounded a little low. What do you want to do? Sitting in front of her was Jiupe, a person who had stood at the top of the heavens for a long time, but now he looked a little lonely. In the past, we wanted to find a place. Jiupe smiled helplessly. Now, I also don't know what he wants to do. Even though they had watched Gu Nan grow into a giant at an unbelievable speed, no one thought that he could surpass them, not even Jiupe. When people were within the scope of their calculations, there would always be times when they made mistakes. Unfortunately, the time left for them to react was too short. In the blink of an eye, Gu Nan had already reached a point where no one could defeat him. Yulian was silent for a while, then said, "He wants Song Fei to make a defensive artifact. There must be a reason." They were all very familiar with Gu Nan's style of doing things. If it was not necessary, Gu Nan would not have stopped at all, nor would he have needed a defensive artifact. When Gu Nan started to think about defense, it meant that he would show a fatal flaw. Jiupe glanced at her and said, "You want to attack first? This is self-defense." Yulian slammed the table and said, "He's a madman. If we don't kill him, we will all die at his hands sooner or later." She regretted not believing in the evil god's words when Austin came looking for her. Of course, it was not that she did not believe in the evil god's brutality and slaughter, but rather that she did not believe in the evil god's power. Anyone who could reach the Tao fusing stage would think the same way. However, the truth was right in front of her, and she had no choice but to believe it. Jiupe stood up and did not directly express his attitude. Instead, he turned around and slowly left. "If you don't succeed, you will die. Have you thought it through?" His voice traveled into Yulian's ears. Chapter 553. Reading. Back then, Schwerin was known as the person closest to path integration. Some people even said that if he wanted to, he could enter the path integration realm at any time. Although Schwerin was already dead, he did prove the latter half of the saying. When he wanted to reach path integration, this obstacle, which others thought was extremely hard, was not difficult for him. But now, it seemed that even Schwerin could not get the title of the person closest to path integration, because it could only belong to Zero. Before Zero was sealed by the second-generation saint, she was only one step away from path integration. Now that her system had been activated by Gu Nan, there was no difficulty in advancing. For Zero, as long as she had enough source of the original realm, she could easily advance. Time passed day by day. Gu Nan stood in the laboratory and watched as Zero and Morag were continuously injected with the source and strengthened. But this process was not fast. Due to the limitations of the two's physiques, the speed of the input of the source could not be increased. This limitation did not depend on the strength of the two, but on the fact that their formats were not strong enough. The operating speed had reached the limit. Song Fei's message came quickly, saying that the defensive ritual implement had been refined and asking Gu Nan to go to Shi Daotian to pick it up. So, Gu Nan stood up and said to the experimenters, "Move the entire laboratory to the God Nation. Continue to input the source. If there are any abnormalities, inform me immediately." Everyone agreed in unison. Only then did Gu Nan leave the laboratory. Before he left, he glanced at Zero and Morag. If everyone who came out of the original realm had a strange format, then wouldn't the original realm be a world of cheats? Gu Nan shook his head. He still needed more examples to prove it. Shi Daotian had also just been rebuilt not long ago. This place was obviously more reliable than the Three Buddha Heaven. Gu Nan stepped into Song Fei's residence. All the new restrictions, matrices, and alarms that the latter had set up were all triggered. For a moment, Shi Daotian was in chaos. Gu Nan's actions, which did not have the demeanor of a master, almost stunned Song Fei. Even for a normal Dao integration stage mighty figure, these things weren't all that impressive and could be easily evaded. However, the next moment these alarms disappeared without a trace. It was not that Song Fei had turned them off, but that Gu Nan had directly stomped on them, leaving nothing behind. Song Fei secretly rolled his eyes. This was not the first time he had seen Gu Nan's unpredictable behavior. He just pretended that he did not see it. It was not a big deal anyway. Old Song, you are very efficient. Gu Nan calculated the time and found that it was exactly 3 months, which was the minimum that Song Fei mentioned. Song Fei was already immune to this title. Shaking his head, he took out a small mirror and handed it to Gu Nan. This is only a half-finished product. Gu Nan took the round mirror and looked at it. The surface of the mirror was as smooth as ice, but the frame beside it was covered with mysterious runes, exuding an ancient and vast aura. This was not surprising, as Song Fei had lived from ancient times to the present. The so-called ancient techniques of the mortal world that had been lost were actually common for Dao integration stage mighty figures and had not been lost at all. What Gu Nan wanted was a heart protection mirror. Of course, the heart protection mirror did not necessarily have to protect the heart. For example, Gu Nan originally wanted to use it to protect his abdomen and block the life and death mark. Although he had already completed the 3rd class advancement, his sin value had not reached the requirement. Gu Nan had never seen such a strange situation. Therefore, at this time, he did not know if the life and death mark still had an effect. However, with Gu Nan's usual cautiousness, it was always right to be prepared. Song Fei saw that he was playing with the round mirror and looked quite satisfied. He sighed and said, "Fa Kong's relic is very powerful. I can only guide a part of its power. If you want to complete this Dharma artifact, it might take more than 200 years, Song Fei said while looking at Gu Nan. Gu Nan did not doubt it. For Dao integration stage mighty figures, it was normal to refine a Dharma artifact for hundreds of years. It would be strange if it could be completed in 3 months. What are the flaws of the semi-finished product? He asked straightforwardly. The strength of the attack it can withstand is not as strong as the finished product. In addition, after withstanding 3 strong attacks, the heart protection mirror will be destroyed. You have to bring it back to me for repair, Song Fei said while pointing at the heart protection mirror. Gu Nan could clearly see that there were 3 longer runes on the frame of the mirror where Song Fei was pointing. They were clearly connected to the inside of the round mirror. That's enough. Gu Nan nodded and placed the heart protection mirror on his abdomen. Having 3 chances to withstand attacks was enough for him to do a lot of things. When the heart protection mirror was placed on Gu Nan's body, the 3 runes began to emit a faint fluorescent light. However, the strange thing was that the fluorescent colors were different. One was black, one was white, and one was green. The next moment, Gu Nan suddenly raised his head and tore off the heart protection mirror that was stuck to his abdomen. The suction force of the heart protection mirror was inexplicably strong, and even a piece of his flesh was torn off. Although he recovered in an extremely short time, Gu Nan had already realized what had happened. Yu Lian. Gu Nan raised his head and looked at the green light in front of him. In front of Gu Nan, Song Fei's figure had already disappeared without a trace. Anyway, the astral plane had just been rebuilt, so he did not feel the pinch. Only the 3 lights of different colors landed and turned into 3 figures. The green light was Yu Lian herself, while the black and white lights were Austin and Daisy, who had descended from the world of gods. In order to deal with Gu Nan, Yu Lian actually chose to join forces with 2 lords. Even after Gu Nan's death, the world of gods might face great pressure from the war. This was because Yu Lian knew very well that if Gu Nan did not die, the pressure would not only come from the battlefield, but also from life and death. She had also wanted to deal with Gu Nan. Back then, Dream Immortal had joined forces with 3 Dao integration cultivators to attack him at the same time, and Yu Lian was no worse off now. Not only had she found 2 top-notch lords, but she had also used the defensive Dharma artifact layout that Gu Nan wanted to set up and tampered with it in advance. This heart protection mirror had no defensive function at all. As long as Gu Nan tried to activate it, the heart protection mirror would automatically stick to Gu Nan's body and activate the power transmission. The power transmission naturally came from Yu Lian and the other 2. It could be said that if Gu Nan had moved just a little bit slower, the combined power of the 3 would have hit the life and death mark. What a pity! Yu Lian's cold voice sounded. Not being able to hit the mark directly meant that both sides were back to the same starting line. Everything still depended on strength. The survival of the 2 great worlds will be decided today, Austin said gloomily. Chapter 554. Read. The safety of the 2 worlds depended on this fight. The 3 of them didn't say anything else and attacked Gu Nan together. Their target was Gu Nan's seal of life and death. Yu Lian had communicated with Austin and the other 2, so she naturally knew the significance of the seal of life and death. Her attacks were even fiercer than the other 2. If the 2 chief gods were defeated, they might still have a chance to survive, but she was destined to face the fate of death and the entire Grotto Void Heaven. The Grotto Void Heaven, which had been passed down for 100,000 years, must not be destroyed in my hands. Yu Lian's eyes were filled with madness, but her Dharma techniques changed unpredictably without any disorder. A Dharma talisman suddenly turned into a long saber and slashed at the seal of life and death. This Dharma talisman was somewhat familiar to Gu Nan. The Dharma talisman that Taoist Spirit Yang had used to kill the Dark God was actually somewhat similar to the one in front of him. As expected, the inheritance that Taoist Spirit Yang had obtained was closely related to the Grotto Void Heaven. At such a critical moment, Gu Nan actually had the time to let his imagination run wild. It could only be said that the thinking speed of people at his level was already incomprehensible. Yu Lian's saber was the first to fall. With an inexplicable sharpness and dominance, it directly slashed at Gu Nan's body. The Tao was the saber, and the saber was the Tao. Unfortunately, Gu Nan's grasp of battle was too sharp. He only needed to tilt his body slightly, and the blade of divine will missed the seal of life and death and only slashed at his waist. The blade of divine will cut off a piece of flesh from Gu Nan's waist, but it recovered in an instant. Gu Nan could completely ignore this level of attack. However, Yu Lian's original intention was to force Gu Nan to dodge. Almost at the same time that Gu Nan moved, Austin's sacred sword pointed at the seal of life and death. Daisy moved later, but arrived first. The law of darkness condensed in the void, and a strange black ball of light directly appeared near the seal. Unlike Austin and the other 2, Daisy's power was more mysterious, unpredictable, and pure. In order to activate the power of the seal, even Austin had to rely on the sacred sword, but Daisy could condense laws out of thin air. In a sense, she was more difficult to deal with than Austin, and the threat she posed was also greater. When the black vortex appeared, Gu Nan reacted extremely quickly. The left side of his body quickly turned into a law, and the position of his life and death mark shifted, causing the black vortex to only hit the shadow that had turned into a law. After 2 transformations, Austin was already infinitely close to Gu Nan. The holy sword in his hand made a turn and headed straight for the seal of life and death. Gu Nan was finally unable to avoid it. Whether it was Yu Lian or Daisy, everything they did was to pave the way for Austin's sword. He had forced Gu Nan into a situation where he could not evade, and Austin had made the final strike. Gu Nan abruptly stopped in his tracks. His right hand, which had yet to be formalized, instantly clenched into a fist and punched Austin's face. Austin's entire body shattered, but the holy sword continued to advance at an extremely fast speed. It looked like it was about to pierce into the life and death imprint. However, at this moment, Gu Nan suddenly pressed down with one hand and grabbed the holy sword. Even though his body was immediately ignited by the holy flames, and his hand was even showing signs of being assimilated by the holy light, he still managed to block it. Daisy was slightly taken aback. Gu Nan's decisiveness was somewhat beyond her expectations. Her reaction was definitely not slow, and the black vortex instantly appeared again. Yulien once again took out the blade of divine will and yelled, "Don't give him any time to breathe." However, before she could finish her sentence, Gu Nan's figure flashed, and his fist, which was covered in raging holy flames, came crashing down. In her shock, Yulien could only use the blade of divine will to block it. Unfortunately, even Austin could not block Gu Nan's fist head-on. The blade of divine will was instantly blasted apart. Even heaven's will could not block Gu Nan. Instead, a golden scale slowly appeared above Yulien's head. There was nothing on either end of the golden scale. Instead, when it appeared, it directly brought Yulien over and placed her on one end of the scale. The person in front of Gu Nan was suddenly Austin. He had already reformed his divine body and appeared in front of Gu Nan. In terms of flexible use of power, someone like Austin was naturally not weaker than anyone else. Come to think of it, Gu Nan had already shattered his divine body no less than 3 or 4 times, but Austin still seemed as if he did not feel it at all. His power was still surging like before. He was actually already well deserving of the title of King of Pantheon. With a wave of the holy sword, Austin blocked Gu Nan for an instant. His figure immediately floated away, and he did not fight him head-on at all. Instead, he pointed his sword at the life and death imprint. Austin's swordsmanship was clearly in the style of the world of Pantheon. It mainly focused on stabbing, which was very different from the swordsmanship of the All Heavens, but the effect was very good. This kind of stabbing might not have been lethal in the past, but it was an excellent match for activating the life and death imprint. Gu Nan did not want to verify if his third transition was up to standard. In fact, he had not even revealed his true power after his third transition. He was waiting for an opportunity to decide the outcome of the battle in one fell swoop. The opportunity that Gu Nan was waiting for came very soon. Daisy took advantage of the moment when Gu Nan retreated, and the dark vortex suddenly exploded. She was personally controlling it with her main body, raising its power to the maximum. She also did not care about her own body. Even if she had to sacrifice one of her divine bodies, she would not give Gu Nan a chance to catch his breath. However, she did not expect that the moment the two of them came into contact, a shadow that seemed to be born from the depths of hell erupted. Daisy, who had always used endless darkness to devour others, felt the feeling of being devoured for the first time. The shadow almost completely enveloped her, and the darkness could only extend an inch from her body before it was immediately assimilated and devoured. She had never seen such a strange nomological power even from Austin. This was a power on a completely different level. If the peak of the second transition was to become one with the nomological power and become the embodiment of the nomological power, then after the third transition, it was Gu Nan himself who was leading the nomological power. He was no longer the will that replaced the nomological power. Instead, he was using his own will to drive the nomological power. If Gu Nan was previously following the nature of the shadow and constantly adjusting himself to the shadow, then he could now manifest the shadow in any form. Daisy could clearly feel this. This is not a shadow. What kind of power is this? The Lady of Darkness roared. She had never seen such a domineering shadow. This kind of power of rapid assimilation was simply the same as Austin's law of light. They were both extremely invasive and had the power to assimilate everything. However, Gu Nan's shadow was more active and more powerful. All of this happened in an instant. Austin and Yulien did not even have time to react. They only heard Daisy's shout, and the law of darkness was instantly annihilated. Julienne stared at this scene in a daze. She murmured, "It's over." Austin's face, which was always as calm as water, also had an ugly expression. Even if Daisy did not die from this attack, she would most likely lose most of her combat strength.